Hey everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know in comments where you're from and what time it is when you're listening. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. Moving into the old house on Ashworth Lane was supposed to be a fresh start. After my divorce, I needed a place to call my own, somewhere quiet where I could rebuild my life without constant reminders of what I'd lost. The rental listing had seemed perfect. A quaint two-story house with a wraparound porch, nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was secluded but not isolated, the sort of place that promised peace. The first thing I noticed about the house was its age. The wood of the porch creaked underfoot, the shutters hung slightly crooked, and the paint was peeling in places. Still, it had a certain charm. The landlord, a wiry man in his 50s named Mr. Darnell, had been quick to brush off its imperfections. "She's old but sturdy," he'd said, handing me the keys. "Been standing here since the 1900s. A bit of history, you know?" History. That word lingered in my mind as I stepped inside for the first time. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something older, like the pages of an ancient book. The hardwood floors gleamed, though the boards groaned softly beneath my weight. The kitchen was small but functional, with an antique gas stove that looked like it belonged in a museum. Upstairs, the 3 bedrooms were modestly sized, with tall windows that let in plenty of light during the day. The master bedroom had a peculiar quirk. The closet door wouldn't stay shut. No matter how many times I closed it, the latch seemed to catch for a moment before softly clicking open again. I decided it wasn't worth worrying about, probably just the house settling or the frame being slightly warped. My first night in the house passed uneventfully. I fell asleep to the sound of cicadas outside the window, wrapped in the strange comfort of a new but unfamiliar space. But by the second night, I noticed the noises. It started as a faint creaking, as though someone were walking across the floorboards downstairs. I chalked it up to the house's age. Wood expands and contracts, right? Houses make noises. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sounds were deliberate, like measured footsteps pacing back and forth. I told myself I was being ridiculous, turned over in bed, and tried to fall asleep. The next morning, as I was unpacking boxes in the living room, a knock startled me. I opened the door to find an older woman standing on the porch. She wore a floral dress and clutched a wicker basket filled with what looked like homemade preserves. "Hi there, I'm Mrs. Callahan," she said with a warm smile. "I live just a few houses down. Thought I'd stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood." I thanked her and we chatted for a while. She seemed sweet, though there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation perhaps. As I took the basket from her hands, she glanced toward the house, her smile faltering. "Not many people stay here long," she said, almost as an afterthought. "Why's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, you know how people can be. Old houses have their quirks, and some folks let their imaginations get the better of them." She hesitated, then added, "There were rumors about the last tenants. Said they heard things, saw things." My stomach tightened. "Like what?" "Oh, I don't know. Footsteps, voices, silly things like that. They left in the middle of the night, didn't even come back for their furniture. But I'm sure it's nothing." She patted my arm reassuringly. "You'll do just fine here." After she left, her words stayed with me. I laughed them off, but that night the creaking returned. Louder this time. The footsteps seemed to move up the stairs, pausing just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, heart pounding, listening intently. But when I finally mustered the courage to peek outside, the hallway was empty. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal had found its way into the walls. I was still adjusting to the new environment. Surely my nerves were playing tricks on me. But deep down, a small voice whispered, "What if it's not?" By the end of my first week, the noises were impossible to ignore. They came every night without fail, always the same. A series of slow, deliberate footsteps that started in the living room and ascended the stairs. I began sleeping with the bedroom door locked, though it did little to ease my anxiety. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt a sudden chill. The air seemed to thicken, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard breathing, low, steady, and impossibly close. I bolted upright, flicking on the bedside lamp, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, silent except for the hum of the old radiator. It wasn't until the following day that I decided to dig a little deeper into the house's past. I started by asking Mrs. Callahan, but she only shrugged and said, "Oh, I'm not one for gossip." Undeterred, I visited the local library. The records were sparse, but I found a newspaper clipping from 1947 about the house's original owner, a man named Elias Hargrave. According to the article, Hargrave had been an eccentric recluse with a fascination for the occult. Neighbors reported strange gatherings at the house, chanting in the dead of night, and odd symbols drawn on the windows. Hargrave disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving the house abandoned for years. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stepped into something far beyond my understanding. Whatever lingered in that house, it wasn't just creaking floorboards or settling wood. It was something alive. I couldn't stop thinking about Elias Hargrave. That name lingered in my mind as though the letters themselves carried weight. I spent the next day poring over everything I could find about him. The library's archives were limited, but I uncovered bits and pieces, enough to paint a picture of someone who was either deeply misunderstood or deeply dangerous. Hargrave was a known recluse who inherited the house on Ashworth Lane from his parents. According to one particularly strange account, he was rarely seen during the day. Instead, neighbors reported lantern light glowing from his windows late into the night. Some claimed to have heard muffled chanting, though no one could say for sure what language it was. The word rituals appeared more than once in the articles, but most of it was speculation. He vanished in 1947, and no body was ever found. The house had changed hands many times since then, but most tenants didn't stay long. I tried to tell myself it was just the ramblings of paranoid townsfolk, a way to explain a man who didn't fit into their small-town norms. But deep down I knew better. The footsteps I heard at night didn't belong to an old house. They were too precise, too deliberate. The following evening, I decided to confront the house itself. I kept my lights off, sitting in the darkened living room with only a flashlight for company. I wanted to see if I could catch whatever was making the noises. If I could identify it, be it an animal or something explainable, I could put my fears to rest. At first, there was only silence. The kind of silence that settles over a place late at night, when the world feels impossibly still. I sat there for what felt like hours, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. My breathing seemed too loud, like it might give me away. And then, just as I was starting to think I'd imagined everything, I heard it. A single heavy footstep. It came from the kitchen, where the old gas stove sat like a relic from another era. My pulse quickened. I clicked on the flashlight and shone the beam toward the doorway, but there was nothing there. Still, the sound had been unmistakable. I wasn't alone. The next step was louder, closer. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay still. The footsteps grew louder with each step, moving toward the living room. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might burst. I aimed the flashlight toward the sound, expecting to see something, someone. But there was nothing. The footsteps stopped just behind the couch where I sat. I felt a cold draft on the back of my neck, and for a moment, it was as if the air itself had shifted, becoming denser, heavier. My fingers trembled as I swung the flashlight around, illuminating the empty room. No footsteps, no intruder, nothing. I bolted upstairs, locking myself in the bedroom like a terrified child. I told myself I was imagining things, that exhaustion and stress were playing tricks on me. But when I finally managed to fall asleep, my dreams were plagued by shadowy figures and whispered voices. The next day, I tried to distract myself with errands. I ran to the grocery store, picked up some supplies for the house, and even treated myself to lunch at a nearby cafe. It was there that I ran into Mrs. Callahan again. She seemed genuinely pleased to see me, though her expression turned somber when I mentioned my research on Elias Hargrave. "You shouldn't dig too deep," she said, her voice low. "Some things are better left alone." "Why?" I asked, leaning closer. "What do you know about him?" She hesitated, glancing around as though worried someone might overhear. Finally, she sighed. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but my grandmother lived on this street when Hargrave was alive. She always said there was something wrong about him. People in the neighborhood swore he was trying to summon something. They said he'd drawn symbols in the dirt around the house, burned things in his yard late at night. My grandmother told me that once she saw him burying something, or someone, in the woods behind the house. Did she ever confront him?" Mrs. Callahan shook her head. "No one dared. But not long after that, he vanished. Some say he left town. Others think whatever he was trying to summon finally took him." Her words sent a chill through me. I thought about the woods behind the house, the dense trees that cast long shadows over the back porch. I'd barely noticed them before, but now I couldn't stop picturing Hargrave digging in the moonlight, burying something that shouldn't have been unearthed. That night, the noises began earlier than usual. It wasn't just footsteps this time. I heard faint scratching sounds like nails dragging across wood. They seemed to come from inside the walls, moving erratically from room to room. I pressed my ear to the wall, my breath catching in my throat, and for a moment I thought I heard whispering. It was too faint to make out, but the tone was unmistakable, low, guttural, and filled with something that sounded disturbingly like malice. I spent the rest of the night huddled in bed, too scared to move. When morning finally came, I made up my mind. I needed answers. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at every sound, feeling like I was being watched. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I decided to check the basement. I hadn't spent much time down there. It was dark, musty, and filled with cobwebs. The previous tenants had left behind a few pieces of furniture, as well as some dusty boxes stacked against the far wall. I worked my way through the clutter, shining the flashlight into every corner. At first, it seemed ordinary enough, just an old basement with sagging beams and peeling paint. But then I noticed something strange, a loose floorboard near the center of the room. My hands trembled as I pried it open. Beneath the board was a small compartment, barely large enough to hold anything significant. Inside, wrapped in brittle, yellowed paper, was a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and faded, but the initials were etched into the corner. It was Elias Hargrave's journal. The journal felt heavier than it should have, as though the leather binding carried more than just pages within it. My fingers hesitated over the worn cover, the etched initials glaring up at me. I told myself I needed to open it, that this was the reason I'd come down to the basement in the first place. But another part of me, one I hadn't acknowledged until now, wanted to toss the thing back into the hole and nail the floorboard shut forever. Instead, I brought it upstairs, setting it down on the dining table as though it were some sacred artifact. I brewed a cup of coffee, trying to delay the inevitable, but the journal sat there, taunting me. Finally, I sat down, took a deep breath, and flipped open the cover. The first page contained a single sentence scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. Asterisk, to seek knowledge is to risk the soul. Asterisk. A shiver ran through me, but I turned the page. What followed was a mixture of journal entries, sketches, and what looked like instructions or rituals. The handwriting changed from neat to erratic as the entries progressed, as if Hargrave's mental state was unraveling over time. The earlier entries were relatively mundane. He wrote about his parents' deaths, inheriting the house, and his desire to uncover hidden truths about the universe. But by the third or fourth entry, the tone shifted. He began referencing the veil and those who dwell beyond. He mentioned strange dreams filled with shadowy figures and described hearing whispers in the house at night. One entry stood out. Asterisk, there is something beneath the house. I can feel it watching me, waiting. The symbols keep it at bay, but I don't know for how much longer. It wants me to open the door. It promises knowledge, power, freedom, but at what cost? The chanting grows louder each night, and I fear I am losing myself. Asterisk. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. The journal confirmed what I already suspected. There was something wrong with this house. Hargrave's words painted a picture of a man teetering on the edge of madness, but were they the ramblings of a paranoid mind? Or was there something more? I skimmed through more entries, my unease growing with each page. The sketches were the worst part. They depicted strange, otherworldly symbols. Circles filled with intricate designs, jagged lines that seemed to writhe on the page, and shapes that didn't quite make sense, as though they belonged to a geometry not of this world. The final entry stopped me cold. Asterisk, tonight I will open the door. If I do not return, let this serve as a warning. The house is cursed. It is not meant for the living. To those who find this journal, I beg of you, leave while you still can. Asterisk. I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Hargrave's words echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the footsteps, the whispers, the cold spots. I wanted to leave, to grab my keys and drive as far away as possible. But a part of me couldn't let go. What door had he opened? What had he unleashed? The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent my heart racing. I felt like I was being watched, though I could never pinpoint the source. And then one night I heard it again. The footsteps. They started in the kitchen just as before, but this time they were faster, more purposeful. My throat tightened as I listened to them move through the house, heading toward the living room. I gripped the flashlight tightly, forcing myself to stay still. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. The doorknob rattled, just slightly, and then there was silence. For a moment I thought it was over. But then I felt it, a cold, oppressive presence pressing down on the room. The air grew heavy, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Something was in the room with me. I didn't dare move, didn't even blink. The flashlight in my hand felt useless, a fragile barrier against whatever was lurking in the darkness. And then I felt it, a weight on the bed as though someone had sat down beside me. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the flashlight toward the bed, my hands trembling. The beam of light revealed an empty mattress, but the weight didn't disappear. If anything, it grew heavier, as though whatever was there wanted me to know it wasn't going anywhere. I bolted from the room, my bare feet slamming against the wooden floors. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't just a creaky floorboard or a drafty window. It was real and it wanted me gone. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed up what little I'd unpacked and called a moving company. But as I loaded my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Before I left, I glanced back at the house one last time. The windows stared back at me, dark and empty. And for a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shadow shifting behind the curtains. I drove away as fast as I could, but the memories of that house stayed with me. Even now, I can still hear the footsteps in my dreams, the cold weight pressing down on my chest. I thought leaving would free me, but I was wrong. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I didn't sleep much after leaving the house. Even though I was miles away, tucked safely into a modest motel room, the events of that night replayed endlessly in my mind. The sound of those footsteps, the rattling doorknob, the weight on the bed, they weren't memories I could shake no matter how hard I tried. But there was something else that stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts like a persistent splinter. The journal. I had brought it with me. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I thought it might help me make sense of what I'd experienced. Either way, it sat there on the nightstand, its worn leather cover almost seeming to pulse under the dim light of the lamp. I debated throwing it away, even burning it, but something stopped me. Deep down, I knew the answers I needed were inside. That night, I opened the journal again. The entries I had read before hadn't made much sense, but now, in the cold quiet of the motel room, I felt like I was seeing them in a new light. Hargrave had been obsessed with uncovering some hidden truth, something he believed was buried beneath the house. His words had the ring of desperation, as though he had been chasing something that kept slipping just out of reach. He mentioned symbols, rituals, and something called the door. What chilled me most, though, were his descriptions of the presence in the house. He wrote about waking in the middle of the night to find it standing over his bed, about hearing whispers in a language he couldn't understand, and about a growing sense that he was no longer alone in his own mind. The house has become a vessel, one entry read. Asterisk, a gateway to something far older and far darker than I can comprehend. I fear it will consume me. Asterisk. As I read, I began to piece together a picture of what Hargrave had been doing. He had found something beneath the house, something he believed was connected to the occult. The symbols he had sketched, the rituals he had described, all seemed designed to communicate with whatever this something was. But it wasn't just communication he sought. He wanted power. One entry in particular made my blood run cold. Asterisk, the whispers grow louder each night. They promise me knowledge, power, and freedom from the constraints of this mortal life. But I know the price will be steep. The veil is thin here, and I fear I may have already crossed it. Asterisk. I put the journal down, my hands trembling. Hargrave had opened a door, and whatever he had invited in had never left. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. I went to the local library, hoping to find some historical records or articles about the house. The librarian, an older woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice, seemed surprised when I mentioned the address. "Oh, that place," she said, her expression darkening. "I thought they'd torn it down years ago." I explained that I had recently rented the house, and her face paled. "People don't stay there long," she said quietly. "There are stories, terrible stories. They say the original owner, Elias Hargrave, was involved in some kind of devil worship. Neighbors reported strange lights and chanting coming from the house at all hours of the night." I pressed her for more details, and she led me to a section of old newspapers. Together, we found several articles about Hargrave. Most were mundane, business dealings, social events, but one stood out. The headline read, Asterisk, local man found dead in apparent ritual gone wrong. Asterisk. The article described how Hargrave's body had been found in the basement, surrounded by strange symbols and burned candles. The cause of death was never officially determined, but neighbors reported hearing screams and unearthly sounds coming from the house the night before. As I read, a cold realization settled over me. Hargrave hadn't just opened a door, he had paid the price for it. The librarian must have seen the fear in my eyes because she placed a hand on my arm. "If I were you," she said softly, "I'd leave that place and never look back." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. That night, back in the motel room, I tried to sleep, but the journal called to me again. I flipped through the pages, my eyes drawn to the strange symbols and rituals Hargrave had described. One sketch in particular caught my attention. It was a crude drawing of a door, surrounded by jagged lines and strange markings. Beneath it, Hargrave had written, "Asterisk, the key is the blood." Asterisk. I didn't know what it meant, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. But I couldn't deny the pull I felt, the nagging curiosity that refused to let me rest. As the hours dragged on, I began to hear noises. At first, I thought it was just the motel settling, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards. But then I heard something else. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. I sat up, straining to hear. The whisper came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the journal. I stared at it, frozen. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and for a moment I thought I could make out words. "Come back," it said. My blood turned to ice. I slammed the journal shut, but the whisper didn't stop. It echoed in my mind, a relentless chant that seemed to seep into my very soul. I knew what it wanted. The house wasn't done with me. The motel felt like a flimsy barricade against the relentless pull of the house. Every corner of my room seemed steeped in shadows that reached for me, every creak of the walls like a whispered plea to return. The journal, now tucked deep in my suitcase, seemed to hum faintly with energy, as though the pages themselves were alive. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I felt like a ghost myself, pale and hollow-eyed as I downed lukewarm coffee from the motel's vending machine. My thoughts churned endlessly. I wanted to leave it all behind, to run far away and forget the house and everything in it, but I knew that wasn't an option. I had to go back. Something inside me, whether it was courage or stupidity I couldn't tell, insisted that I needed to confront whatever was happening. Maybe it was the journal. Maybe it was my pride. Maybe I just couldn't stand the thought of being a pawn in some dark game I didn't understand. By midday, I was driving back toward the house. The streets grew narrower and quieter as I approached, the hum of the city fading into an eerie stillness. When I pulled up to the driveway, the house loomed over me, dark and menacing under a gray sky. For a moment, I just sat in the car, staring at it. The windows were dark, the front porch sagging slightly, but I swore I could feel it watching me. I stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my feet breaking the silence. The air was colder than it should have been, a sharp chill that sank into my bones. As I climbed the steps to the front door, my hand hesitated on the doorknob. Was I really ready for this? The whispering started again, faint but unmistakable, seeping through the cracks in the door. I swallowed hard and turned the knob. Inside, the house was exactly as I had left it, but it felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. I could hear faint creaks above me as though someone, or something, was walking around upstairs. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The first thing I did was head to the basement. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I thought I'd find answers there, or maybe I just wanted to get it over with. The door to the basement groaned as I opened it, revealing the steep, narrow staircase. The air grew colder with every step I took, and by the time I reached the bottom, my breath was visible in front of me. The basement was exactly as I remembered it, cluttered, dusty, and filled with the faint smell of mildew. But something was different. The symbols I had noticed before, faint and barely visible, were now glowing faintly, a sickly green light that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I approached one of them, running my fingers over the rough surface of the wall. The glow flickered and grew brighter, as though it was responding to my touch. The journal was right. This wasn't just a house. It was a gateway. I turned to leave, but something stopped me in my tracks. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, came from the corner of the basement. A whisper. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it wasn't just a random noise. It was saying something. Asterisk, why did you come back? Asterisk. I spun around, my eyes darting to the shadows. There was no one there, but the voice continued, growing louder and more insistent. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here. Asterisk. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the staircase. As I climbed, the voice followed me, echoing through the walls. Asterisk, you can't escape. Asterisk. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, leaning against it as I struggled to catch my breath. The house was silent again, but I knew better than to trust it. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I grabbed the journal from my bag and flipped through the pages, searching for anything that might help. One entry caught my eye, written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl. Asterisk, the veil is thinning. The house is the anchor, the tether that keeps it here. If I can sever the connection, I might be able to stop it. But I'll need the key, the blood. Asterisk, the blood. My mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what I had read. Hargrave had mentioned something about a ritual, about using blood to open the door. But what if blood was also the way to close it? I didn't want to think about what that might mean. The house groaned around me, the floorboards creaking as though something heavy was moving upstairs. I glanced toward the staircase, dread pooling in my stomach. I wasn't alone. I moved as quietly as I could, creeping toward the front door. My plan was simple: get out, find help, and figure out what to do from a safe distance. But as I reached for the doorknob, the house seemed to shift around me. The walls groaned, the floor buckled, and the door slammed shut on its own. Panic surged through me as I tugged at the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering started again, louder this time, coming from every direction. Asterisk, stay. Asterisk. The lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. I turned, my back pressed against the door, and saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood at the top of the staircase, its form shrouded in darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. And then it started to descend. One step at a time, slow and deliberate, the figure moved closer. My body refused to obey me, frozen in place as the air grew colder and the whispers reached a deafening pitch. When it reached the bottom of the stairs, it stopped. For a moment there was silence. And then it spoke. Asterisk, you opened the door. Now you must pay the price. Asterisk. The figure surged forward and the world went black. I awoke to darkness, a suffocating void that pressed in from all sides. My body felt heavy, pinned down as though the weight of the house itself was pressing on my chest. The air was frigid, sharp and biting against my skin, and the silence was so profound it seemed to hum in my ears. I tried to move, but my arms and legs wouldn't obey. Panic clawed at my throat as I strained against the invisible force holding me in place. My breaths came shallow and quick, each one filling my lungs with icy air. Then a sound broke the silence, the faint creak of footsteps. They were deliberate, slow, and unbearably loud against the quiet. The sound drew closer, the weight of each step reverberating through the floorboards. My pulse hammered in my ears as I realized the footsteps were heading straight for me. Suddenly I could move again. I sat up abruptly, gasping for air as the oppressive weight lifted. The darkness around me wasn't total. I could just barely make out the faint outline of the room. I was still in the house, lying on the living room floor. But I wasn't alone. A shadowy figure loomed at the edge of my vision, its form indistinct but undeniably human-shaped. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with a crushing sense of dread. I scrambled backward, my hands slipping on the cold, wooden floor. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head as if considering my question. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, it answered. Asterisk, I am what he brought forth. Asterisk. My heart stopped. Who? Hargrave? The figure didn't respond, but the temperature in the room plummeted even further. My breath came out in visible puffs, the air so cold it burned my throat. I don't understand, I stammered. What do you want from me? The figure took a step forward, and for the first time I could make out some of its features. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a shifting mass of darkness, constantly in motion like smoke trapped in a glass jar. He opened the door, it said, its voice low and resonant, vibrating through my bones. Asterisk, you must close it. Asterisk. My mind raced, trying to process its words. The door? You mean the ritual? The symbols? The figure nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Asterisk, the anchor must be broken. The blood must seal what was unsealed. Asterisk. The words from Hargrave's journal flashed in my mind. Asterisk, the veil is thinning. The house is the anchor, the tether that keeps it here. If I can sever the connection, I might be able to stop it. But I'll need the key, the blood. Asterisk. My stomach twisted in knots. You mean, my blood? The figure didn't answer, but its silence was confirmation enough. No, I said, shaking my head. There has to be another way. I can't. The figure moved closer, and the room seemed to shrink around me. The walls groaned and shifted, the house itself protesting my resistance. If you do not seal it, others will suffer, the figure said, its voice softer now, almost pleading. Asterisk, it will not stop. Asterisk. I thought of the journal, the frantic scribbles of someone who had tried, and failed, to stop whatever darkness had been unleashed. I thought of the whispers, the cold spots, the oppressive weight of the house. And I thought of the footsteps, the figure at the top of the stairs, the overwhelming sense of being watched. What happens if I don't? I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer with words. Instead, it raised a hand, or something like a hand, and pointed toward the staircase. I followed its gesture, my eyes widening in horror. Figures were descending the stairs, dozens of them, their forms shrouded in the same shifting darkness. They moved silently, their footsteps eerily synchronized, their faces voids of nothingness. They will come, the figure said. Asterisk, and they will never stop. Asterisk. A wave of cold fear washed over me, but beneath it, something else stirred, determination. I didn't want to die, but I couldn't let this thing continue, couldn't let the house claim more lives. What do I have to do? I asked, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. The symbols, it said. Asterisk, complete the ritual. Seal the door with your blood. Only then will it end. Asterisk. I swallowed hard, nodding. The figure extended a hand toward me, and though I hesitated, I reached out and took it. The sensation was like plunging my hand into ice water, a numbing cold that seeped into my bones. Suddenly, I wasn't in the living room anymore. I stood in the basement, the glowing symbols on the walls casting an eerie light. The figure was gone, but its voice echoed in my mind, guiding me. Asterisk, draw the circle. Speak the words. Offer the blood. Asterisk. My hands trembled as I grabbed a piece of chalk from the floor, its surface worn smooth from use. I began to draw, the symbols flowing from my memory as though they had been etched into my mind. The air grew heavier with each stroke, the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on me. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, but I forced myself to focus. When the circle was complete, I knelt in its center, clutching the piece of chalk so tightly it crumbled in my hand. The final step. I hesitated, my gaze flicking to the knife that had appeared in the center of the circle. Its blade gleamed faintly in the dim light, the edge razor sharp. My blood. The thought made my stomach churn, but I knew I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I picked up the knife, its cold handle sending a shiver down my spine. With trembling hands, I pressed the blade to my palm, closing my eyes as I made the cut. Pain flared briefly, sharp and hot, before dulling to a throbbing ache. Blood welled up, dripping onto the floor, and the symbols flared to life, their glow almost blinding. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a deafening roar that filled the room. And then everything went silent. The air grew still, the weight lifted, and for the first time since I had moved into the house, I felt peace. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from the darkest corner of the basement. Asterisk, it is not over. Asterisk. I froze, the faint whisper echoing in my mind, even as the glowing symbols on the basement walls began to dim. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to face the dark corner where the voice had come from. It was pitch black, darker than any shadow should be, and it felt as though the space itself was watching me, waiting for something. It's done, I said aloud, my voice trembling but firm. I did what you asked. The darkness didn't answer. Instead, it seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting like a living, breathing thing. The air grew colder again, and the oppressive weight that had just lifted began pressing down on me once more. No, I whispered, backing away toward the stairs. This is over. I did what you said. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The house wasn't letting me go, not yet. As I reached the base of the stairs, a low, guttural sound rumbled through the basement. It was like a growl, deep and primal, vibrating through the walls and floor. My hand shot out to grab the railing, but it was slick with moisture, cold and clammy like it had been submerged in icy water. I yanked my hand back and stared at the railing in the dim light. It was covered in a thin layer of something black and viscous like tar. My stomach turned as the substance began to drip, spreading slowly across the wooden steps. The growl grew louder and I could feel it in my chest, shaking me to my core. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the dark corner of the basement. And then it stepped out. The figure was no longer a shadowy, indistinct shape. It had formed now, tall and impossibly thin, with long, spindly limbs that moved with unnatural fluidity. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at sharp angles. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a grotesque mask of emptiness, with hollow pits where eyes should have been and a wide, gaping mouth that seemed to stretch too far. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It stared at me with its eyeless face, and though it made no sound, I could feel its thoughts pressing into my mind. It was ancient, hungry, and angry. The ritual hadn't stopped it. It had only woken it up. "You're not real," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You can't be real." The creature tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural. And then it took a step toward me. That was enough to break the paralysis. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slipping and stumbling as the black tar-like substance spread beneath my feet. The growl turned into a roar, so loud it seemed to shake the entire house. I hit the door at the top of the stairs with my shoulder, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind me. My hands fumbled for the lock, twisting it into place as the sound of heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. For a moment, everything was silent. I pressed my ear to the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I tried to listen. And then the door rattled violently, the handle twisting and turning as something on the other side tried to get in. I backed away, my heart racing. The sound of scratching filled the air, sharp and frantic, like nails being dragged across wood. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The scratching stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then, in a voice that was both guttural and chillingly human, it spoke. "You cannot undo what he did. You cannot seal what is already open." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "The ritual, it was supposed to stop this." The voice let out a low, mocking laugh. "You do not understand. The house is the door. You are the key. And now it is free." A cold realization washed over me. I wasn't just a victim of the house. I was part of it now, tied to whatever darkness Hargrave had unleashed. The ritual hadn't sealed anything. It had only strengthened the connection between me and the entity. The floor beneath me groaned, and I felt a sudden, violent tug, like invisible hands were trying to drag me back toward the basement. I stumbled forward, grabbing onto the edge of the kitchen counter for support. "I'm leaving," I said aloud, more to myself than to whatever was listening. "I'm leaving this house and I'm never coming back." But even as I said the words, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The house didn't want me to leave. The lights flickered, and the walls seemed to close in, the once familiar space now alien and menacing. Shadows danced across the room, twisting into grotesque shapes that reached out for me. I ran for the front door, my feet slipping on the cold, slick floor. The shadows followed, their claw-like hands stretching toward me. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp. When I reached the door, I yanked it open and stumbled outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and for a brief moment I felt relief. But as I turned back to look at the house, I saw them. Dozens of figures stood in the windows, their hollow faces watching me. Their shapes were distorted, their features blending into the darkness, but their presence was unmistakable. The house was alive, and it wasn't done with me. I stood frozen on the front lawn, my breath visible in the icy air. The oppressive weight of the house loomed behind me, its windows filled with shadowy figures. They stood still, their eyeless faces turned toward me, unblinking and motionless. My legs screamed at me to run, to leave the property and never look back, but my mind was trapped in a loop of terror. The figures didn't move, but I felt their attention pressing against me like a suffocating fog. It was as though the house itself was staring at me through them, alive, aware, and furious. "Leave me alone," I screamed into the night, my voice echoing off the silent street. For a moment, nothing happened. The figures remained still, their silhouettes blending into the darkness behind the glass. Then, slowly, the front door creaked open behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The door swung wide, revealing the dimly lit hallway. It was empty, no figures, no shadows, just the faint hum of electricity and the rhythmic groan of the house settling. But the open door felt like an invitation, a beckoning call that sent shivers down my spine. "No," I whispered, stepping back. "I'm not going back in there." But the pull was stronger now, an invisible force tugging at me, urging me toward the house. My feet felt heavy, as though the ground beneath me was trying to drag me back. "I'm done with this," I said aloud, trying to convince myself more than anything. I turned away, forcing myself to focus on the street ahead. My car was parked just a few yards away, and if I could just get to it, I could drive far away from this nightmare. I started walking, each step feeling like I was wading through water. The air around me grew thicker, colder, and the sound of my own heartbeat thundered in my ears. And then, as I reached the edge of the driveway, I heard it. A child's laughter. It was soft, almost playful, but there was something off about it, something hollow and broken. It sent a chill down my spine, and I froze in place. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The laughter came again, closer this time, echoing in the stillness of the night. Slowly I turned back toward the house. The figures in the windows were gone. The front door was still wide open, the warm glow of the hallway spilling out onto the porch. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. But then I saw her. A little girl stood just inside the doorway, her face pale and expressionless. She wore a white nightgown that hung loosely on her thin frame, and her dark hair fell in tangled strands around her shoulders. Her eyes, oh God, her eyes, were black, bottomless voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. She tilted her head as though studying me, and then she smiled. "Come play with me," she said, her voice soft and sweet, like a distant melody. My stomach twisted and I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. No, you're not real. You're not real." The girl's smile widened, stretching unnaturally across her face. She took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. "You can't leave," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Not yet. The house isn't done with you." I turned and ran. I sprinted to my car, fumbling for my keys with trembling hands. The child's laughter followed me, growing louder, more distorted, until it was no longer laughter but a shrill, inhuman scream. I yanked the car door open and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life and I hit the gas, peeling out of the driveway. As I sped down the street, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my chest heaving with panic. The house stood silent and dark, its windows empty once more. But the front door was still open, and in the faint glow of the porch light, I saw her. The little girl stood at the edge of the driveway, her black eyes fixed on me. She raised a hand, waving slowly as though bidding me farewell. And then she was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, my heart racing and my mind spinning. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and parked under the fluorescent lights, desperate for some sense of normalcy. But even as I sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The car felt too quiet, too still. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the little girl's face staring back at me. It was empty. I leaned back in my seat, trying to catch my breath. "It's over," I whispered to myself. "It's over." But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The house had let me leave, but I could still feel its presence, lingering like a shadow at the edge of my mind. Whatever Hargrave had unleashed, whatever darkness he had invited into that house, it wasn't bound by walls or doors. And it wasn't done with me. I spent the night in my car. The gas station parking lot was brightly lit, with the comforting hum of activity around me, cars pulling in and out, people chatting, the clink of a cash register. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, made my heart jump. Sleep was out of the question. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the little girl in the nightgown, her black, endless eyes staring into mine. Her voice echoed in my mind, soft and haunting. "You can't leave. Not yet." By dawn, I was a wreck. My hands trembled as I sipped on a bitter cup of gas station coffee, trying to focus on anything but the events of the night before. I needed a plan. I couldn't go back to the house, not after what I'd seen, but I couldn't just leave everything behind either. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That my house was haunted? That a ghostly little girl had told me I couldn't leave? They'd laugh me out of the station, or worse, they'd think I was crazy. Instead, I decided to dig deeper into the house's history. If Hargrave had really been involved in the occult, there had to be records, something that could explain what was happening. Maybe I could find a way to stop it. I drove to the local library, parking in a secluded spot far from the main entrance. The librarian, an older woman with a warm smile and kind eyes, greeted me as I walked in. "Good morning. Can I help you find anything?" "Actually, yes," I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "I'm looking for information on a house in town, an old one. It belonged to a man named Victor Hargrave." Her smile faltered and a shadow passed over her face. "Hargrave," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're talking about the Greystone house, aren't you?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "Yes. Do you know anything about it?" She hesitated, glancing around the empty library as if afraid someone might overhear. Then she leaned in, lowering her voice. "That house, it's not a place anyone should live. There's a darkness there, something that lingers. I've heard stories, awful things about what happened to people who stayed there too long." "What kind of things?" I asked, leaning forward. She hesitated again, then sighed. "The Hargrave family was peculiar. Victor especially. He was obsessed with the occult, Rituals, summoning spirits, that sort of thing. People said he was trying to contact something, though no one knows what. After his death, strange things started happening in that house. Tenants would complain of noises, shadows, feeling like they were being watched. Some claimed to see figures in the windows when no one else was home. And then there were the disappearances. Disappearances? I echoed, my stomach churning. Over the years, people who lived there would simply vanish. No trace, no explanation. One woman was found wandering the streets, babbling incoherently about curses and doors that wouldn't stay closed. She refused to go back, said the house wouldn't let her leave. The librarian shivered, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself. That place isn't safe. If you're living there, my advice is to get out. Leave everything behind if you have to, but don't stay. Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't just walk away. Not yet. Do you have any records on the house? Old newspapers, property records, anything? She nodded reluctantly. There might be something in the archives. Follow me. I followed her to a small room at the back of the library, filled with dusty filing cabinets and stacks of yellowed newspapers. She pointed to a cabinet labeled Historical Properties and left me to my search. Hours passed as I sifted through old articles and records. Most of it was mundane: deeds, renovation permits, property sales. But then I found it, an article from the local paper dated 1923, titled Mystery at Greystone Manor. The article detailed Victor Hargrave's sudden and unexplained death. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house on the night he died, chanting, screams, and a loud crash. When police arrived, they found Hargrave's body in the basement, surrounded by strange symbols painted on the walls and what appeared to be blood. The cause of death was never determined, and the case was closed as an accident. But the article hinted at something darker, mentioning rumors of Hargrave's involvement in the occult and the strange, otherworldly objects found in the basement. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the final paragraph. Though the house has stood empty for months, neighbors continue to report strange occurrences: lights flickering in the windows, the sound of footsteps on the stairs, and most chillingly, the laughter of a child echoing through the halls. The laughter of a child. My hands shook as I folded the newspaper and placed it back in the file. Whatever Hargrave had done, whatever he had summoned, it was still there. And now it had its sights on me. The drive back to the house was slow and nerve-wracking. I didn't want to return, but I couldn't leave without my belongings, or at least without understanding what I was up against. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood silent and dark, as though waiting for me. The air was heavy, oppressive, and I hesitated before stepping out of the car. This time, I didn't bother with the front door. I went around to the back, where a small window in the kitchen was slightly ajar. Climbing through, I landed softly on the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I crept through the kitchen, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. I needed to find the basement. If Hargrave had been performing rituals down there, maybe I could find something, anything, that would explain how to stop this. As I opened the door to the basement, a cold gust of air rushed past me, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and then began my descent. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing in the darkness. The basement was freezing, and I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, stone-walled room. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, their lines jagged and erratic. In the center of the room was a crude altar, covered in dried blood and surrounded by melted candles. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminating the objects scattered across the altar: a rusted knife, a tattered book, and a small child's doll with empty black eyes. The doll seemed to stare at me, its vacant gaze sending shivers down my spine. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed the fabric, a deafening scream filled the room. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical force slamming into me and knocking me to the ground. The flashlight skittered across the floor, its beam flickering wildly. And then I saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness around them. They moved slowly, their eyeless faces turned toward me, and I felt the same suffocating pressure I had felt outside the house. The little girl was among them, her nightgown glowing faintly in the dim light. She stepped forward, her black eyes fixed on mine, and smiled. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. My heart raced as the figures closed in, their movements slow but deliberate. I scrambled backward, my hands searching desperately for the flashlight. And then the girl reached out, her cold, bony fingers brushing against my arm. Darkness consumed me. When I woke up, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. I was lying on the cold, stone floor of the basement, my body aching as if I'd been dragged across the rough surface. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. I tried to sit up, but my head spun. The room was dim, the flashlight still lying near the altar, its light flickering weakly against the darkness. The figures were gone, as was the little girl, though her presence still lingered, like a shadow hovering just at the edge of my vision. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. The pain in my head was sharp, but it wasn't the physical pain that scared me, it was the feeling of something still being here in this room with me. The silence pressed in around me, the oppressive weight of it almost suffocating. I managed to get to my feet, my legs unsteady as I staggered toward the stairs. The basement seemed to stretch endlessly behind me, the walls closing in as I climbed back toward the light. Each step felt like a betrayal of my body, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of the house before it consumed me entirely. But I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. I made my way back through the house, every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet making my heart skip a beat. It felt different now, emptier, darker, as if the house itself had grown hungrier in the time I had been gone. When I reached the living room, I froze. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't quite describe, like something alive was pressing in from every direction. The windows were all sealed tight, no breeze stirring the curtains, but the air was thick with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Then I heard it. The sound I had been dreading since the moment I first set foot in the house. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and slow, coming from somewhere above me. The floorboards creaked in protest, the sound growing louder and closer with each passing second. My breath caught in my throat and I looked up toward the stairs. The footsteps stopped. A tense silence followed, like the whole house was holding its breath. I waited. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. And then, just as suddenly, the footsteps started again. But this time, they weren't coming from the floor above. They were coming from inside my head. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to block out the noise. The sound was so real, so vivid, that I could feel the vibrations in my bones. The steps seemed to echo inside me, growing louder, more insistent, until the pounding was deafening. And then, like a switch had been flipped, the noise stopped. I was alone again, or so I thought. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any noise. It was as if the house was waiting for something, or someone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave, to run. But I couldn't. Not until I found out what had happened to the people who had lived here before me. I knew the truth was in the basement, those symbols, the doll, the book. But I couldn't bring myself to go back down there, not yet. Instead, I went to the library, determined to search for answers. The room was cold and quiet, the air stale from years of disuse. The shelves were packed with old books, their spines cracked and worn as if they had been forgotten by time. I scanned the titles, my fingers trembling as I searched for anything that might help. It wasn't long before I found what I was looking for. A thick, leather-bound journal sat in the corner, its pages yellowed and brittle. The cover was embossed with strange symbols, symbols I recognized from the basement. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I opened the book. The handwriting inside was neat but frantic, the words scrawled in a hurried, almost desperate manner. It took me a few moments to adjust to the faded ink, but when I did, the words hit me like a punch to the gut. I have opened the door. There is no turning back now. The entry was dated just days before Hargrave's death. The following pages were filled with details about rituals, dark incantations, and descriptions of things that didn't belong in the world I knew. Hargrave had been trying to summon something he had called the Watcher, a creature that existed between the realms of the living and the dead. He had thought he could control it, that by offering it power he could bend it to his will. But the more I read, the more I realized that he had underestimated what he was dealing with. The Watcher was not something to be controlled. It was a force, an ancient, malevolent entity that fed on fear, on suffering, and on souls. And Hargrave had opened the door for it to enter this world. The last entry in the journal sent a chill through my entire body. I can hear it now, scratching at the door, waiting for me. I have failed. The house will not let me go. It wants me to stay. And it will not stop until I do. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. The journal fell silent in my hands, but its words echoed in my mind, a warning that I hadn't heeded. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, a vessel for the dark entity that Hargrave had invited in. And now it wanted me. I stumbled back toward the living room, the weight of the journal heavy in my hands. The house seemed to close in on me as I walked, the walls pressing in, the air growing colder with each step. The The lights flickered above me, and I knew that whatever was in this place, it was watching me. The footsteps started again. This time they weren't coming from above. They were coming from inside the room with me. I turned, and there she was, the little girl in the nightgown, standing in the doorway. Her black eyes locked onto mine, her mouth stretched into an eerie smile. "You can't leave," she whispered. "You're part of the house now." My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, the room spinning around me. I felt the air grow colder, and I knew with a terrible certainty that there was no escape. The house had claimed me, and it wasn't going to let me go. I don't know how much time passed after the girl spoke. I couldn't look at her, couldn't focus on anything but the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped my chest. The cold air seemed to freeze the blood in my veins as I backed away, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of this house before it swallowed me whole, but my feet wouldn't move. They were stuck to the floor as if the house itself had rooted me in place. The girl's smile widened, her eyes never leaving mine. There was no humanity left in her face, just a hollow emptiness that made my skin crawl. I felt the temperature drop even further, the air thick with an unnatural chill. It was as though something was moving through the house with us, something ancient and angry. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice high-pitched and mocking, echoing in my mind. "The Watcher is waiting. It won't let you leave." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to throw myself at the door and never look back. But as I glanced around, the walls seemed to be closing in, shifting in ways I couldn't explain. The house had become a labyrinth, its hallways twisting and bending like a nightmare, mocking my every attempt to escape. I glanced down at the journal still clutched tightly in my hands. The words from Hargrave's final entry kept repeating in my mind. Asterisk, "The house will not let me go. It wants me to stay. And it will not stop until I do." Asterisk, the realization hit me like a freight train. The house didn't just want to trap me, it needed me. The footsteps began again, but this time they were louder, closer, as if whatever was in the house was moving toward me. My breath quickened, my pulse racing as I scanned the room, searching for any escape. But the doors were all shut tight, the windows sealed. There was no way out. I turned back to the girl, her dark eyes gleaming with something ancient and hungry. The air around her seemed to shimmer, like a heat wave rising from the floor. She tilted her head, studying me with an unsettling curiosity. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice almost sympathetic. "But now you're part of it. You'll never leave. You'll never be free." I couldn't breathe. The house seemed to press in on me from all sides, its weight crushing me. The temperature continued to plummet, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay and mildew, the stench of death that clung to the walls. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound like a distant growl, coming from deep within the house. It was the sound of something monstrous, something that had been lurking in the shadows for too long. The Watcher. I had read about it in the journal, how it had been summoned by Hargrave's rituals, how it fed on fear and suffering. But it was more than that. It was a presence, a malevolent force that existed between the living and the dead, waiting for an invitation to cross over into this world. And Hargrave had given it that invitation. The sound grew louder, closer. The floorboards beneath me began to shake, the walls groaning as if the house itself was alive, writhing in pain. The girl took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "You'll see," she said, her smile twisting into something darker, something more sinister. "It's here." The lights above flickered wildly, casting long, erratic shadows across the room. The air was thick with static, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I could feel something heavy and powerful, entering the room with me. The temperature dropped even further, and I saw my breath cloud in front of me, freezing in the air. And then I heard the sound. A loud bang from above, followed by heavy, dragging footsteps. The noise was deafening now, the sound of something, or someone, slowly descending the stairs. My body went numb with terror, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark corner where the footsteps were coming from. Suddenly, the door slammed open with a force that sent me stumbling backward. I fell to the floor, my heart racing as I looked up at the figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly tall, its silhouette obscured by shadows. The room felt suffocating, like the air was being sucked out of the space around me. The figure didn't move, just stood there, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then it spoke. "It's time." The voice was like nails scraping against stone, deep and hollow, echoing in my mind like a warning. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like jelly, my body refusing to obey my commands. The girl's laughter echoed in the background, a high, mocking sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The figure took a slow step forward, its heavy footfall sending vibrations through the floor. I could feel it coming closer, and with each step, the house seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The air thickened, suffocating me, and I gasped for breath. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The Watcher was here, and it was coming for me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air around me had turned to lead, suffocating and heavy, as though the house itself was swallowing me whole. The figure in the doorway was no longer just a silhouette. It had taken shape, dark and imposing, its form a twisted amalgamation of shadow and darkness. The deeper I looked into its eyes, or what I thought were eyes, the more I felt myself unraveling. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. It was as though the very walls of the house were holding me in place, trapping me in this moment of sheer terror. The floor beneath me felt like it was tilting, warping in impossible angles. My vision blurred, and I heard the whispering again, soft at first but growing louder, like 1,000 voices all speaking in unison. "It's time." The words reverberated through my skull, sending waves of icy fear straight to my core. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse erratic and wild. The Watcher was here, and its presence was more overwhelming than I could ever have imagined. The girl, who wasn't a girl at all but something else entirely, stepped closer to me, her smile stretching impossibly wide. It wasn't human. Nothing about her was. Her eyes, empty and hollow, gleamed with a cold malice, and I could feel her breath on my skin, chilling me to the bone. The sound of her footsteps seemed to echo through the room, though she barely moved. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice a sickly sweet whisper that made my stomach churn. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry and my lips felt numb. I couldn't even cry out for help, if anyone were even out there to hear it. The house had become its own prison, its own world where time seemed to stretch and warp. I was alone, alone with whatever had been summoned here. The Watcher took another step forward, its presence so vast, so immense, that it seemed to fill the entire room. I could feel its gaze on me, though it had no eyes, no face. Just a void, a hole that seemed to suck everything into it. My body trembled uncontrollably, and I had to fight every instinct to run, to flee. But I couldn't. Its voice came again, deep and hollow, like the sound of the earth cracking open. "You invited me." I couldn't respond. My chest felt like it was caving in, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe in and out with a life of their own. Every inch of the house felt wrong, alien. The air was thick with an unholy presence, something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting for this moment. Suddenly the ground beneath me cracked. A low rumble, like the roar of a beast, echoed through the house. The room began to shift and change, the walls warping and twisting, bending in unnatural ways. I could feel something pulling at me, something tugging me toward the center of the room. The Watcher's shadow loomed over me, its shape shifting, growing larger, expanding. I could hear it breathing now, deep and heavy, filling the air with the scent of earth and decay. The girl was gone, vanished into the darkness, leaving only the echo of her laughter behind. But the Watcher remained, an immovable force. It was everywhere now, in the walls, the air, the ground. It was suffocating me. I tried to speak, tried to beg for mercy, but no words came out. My mouth was dry, my throat closed tight. The air was thick with terror, and every breath I took felt like it was choking me. "You cannot escape," the Watcher whispered, its voice a low hiss that slithered through the air. "You are mine now." And then the room exploded in a violent burst of sound. The floor beneath me cracked open, the walls caving in on themselves. A darkness deeper than the night filled the room, and I felt myself being pulled, dragged by an unseen force toward the abyss. I screamed, though no sound escaped my lips. My vision blurred, my body numb, my thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. I was falling into a void that had no end. My body tumbled through endless darkness, through a space that felt like it existed outside of time. I reached out, grasping for anything, but there was nothing. Nothing but the cold, suffocating air that surrounded me, crushing me from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I was lying on the floor, gasping for air, my chest heaving with panic. The house was silent now, eerily so. The oppressive weight of fear had lifted, but it wasn't gone. It lingered like a shadow just out of reach. The walls around me were still the same, the old, creaky house that had once felt like a place of refuge. But now it felt wrong. It was suffocating, the air thick with the presence of something that still lingered. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to escape. My legs were weak, unsteady, but I had to get out. I had to leave before whatever it was that had haunted this place found me again. I rushed to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. It turned easily as if the house itself was letting me go, letting me leave. But as I stepped out into the hallway, I heard it. A soft, dragging sound coming from the far end of the hall. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps. I turned around, but the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the house like the final nail in a coffin. I had to get out. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the footsteps following me, always just behind me, never stopping. The house was alive. It wouldn't let me go. And as I finally reached the front door, I realized it was already too late. The Watcher had found me. Story 2. I've always been the kind of person who thought the quiet life would be enough. The kind of life where I could live in peace, away from the noise of the city. So, when the divorce went through, I packed my things and decided to move into a small, quiet house just outside of town. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to start fresh, find some peace, and put the past behind me. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside. Nothing special, just an old two-story with faded blue paint and a front porch that creaked when you stepped on it. It wasn't exactly cozy, but it was affordable. Perfect for someone trying to rebuild. It had been vacant for a while, which I was told was a good thing. No other tenants for a while. You'll be fine, the real estate agent had assured me with a forced smile. It didn't matter. I wasn't worried about that. When I first walked inside, the place had that musty smell that older houses often have. The kind that made you think of dust, age, and the slow passage of time. But it felt like home in a way. The floors creaked under my feet, and the wood had a weathered look, but it wasn't enough to make me second-guess my decision. The hardwood floors, the thick curtains, the worn-down furniture. Everything had its place, and I could see myself getting comfortable here. I spent the first couple of days unpacking, setting up my things, and adjusting to the quiet. There was no rush to anything anymore. No need to answer calls or attend appointments. Just me, my thoughts, and the house that was slowly becoming my new reality. The neighbors weren't much to speak of. The house was isolated enough that the closest neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Walker, was a good 100 yards down the street. She made it a point to introduce herself, but her words seemed odd, like she was hesitant to welcome me completely. "The house you're in, it's been through a lot," she said with a glance over her shoulder, her voice lower than normal, almost as though she was afraid someone might hear. "People don't usually stay long in that place, you know? Strange things that happen when the moon is high. I'm sure you'll be fine though." It was the first mention of anything unusual about the house, and it left a slight chill creeping down my spine. But I didn't let it linger long. People talk. I told myself she was just one of those old folks who like to spread rumors. Everyone does it at some point. That night, I tried to settle into my new routine. It was quiet, peaceful, almost too quiet. The only sounds were the occasional wind tapping against the windows or the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet. But that night, as I lay in bed, the silence became something else. Something more oppressive. I chalked it up to the house settling, to the age of the walls, the way old places have a tendency to make sounds in the dark. But something about the quiet made me uneasy. The house seemed to be watching, waiting. I didn't sleep well that first night. The faintest sounds woke me up more than once. I heard the shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. I tried to ignore them, convincing myself it was just the house, or maybe my imagination running wild. But there it was again, and again. Around midnight, I heard it for the third time. A thud, like someone, or something, had dropped a heavy object on the floor upstairs. I got up, heart pounding, and went to check. But when I reached the top of the stairs, there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no evidence of a mistake or misstep. Just the same silence that had filled the house before. I stood there in the dark, trying to convince myself it was just my nerves. After all, the house was old. It had a history, I supposed. Things creaked, things groaned. It didn't mean anything. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went back to bed and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next day, I ran into Mrs. Walker again while I was taking the trash out. She gave me a long, hard look as though she were weighing me up. "You hear anything last night?" she asked, her voice low, almost secretive. I nodded, trying to act casual. "Some strange sounds. But I guess that's just how old houses are, right?" She didn't seem convinced. "The house, well, it has a way of revealing itself to you," she said, looking me straight in the eye. "It's not the kind of place you can just ignore. It gets into your mind, makes you think you're imagining things. But trust me, it's not your imagination." I didn't know what to say to that. I forced a smile, nodded, and moved on with my day. But as I walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something I didn't. and I had a creeping suspicion that whatever she was hinting at wasn't just some silly town rumor. This house, was hiding something. Something I was bound to uncover sooner or later. Little did I know, my life was about to be turned upside down by whatever secrets the house was keeping. The days passed slowly. I fell into a rhythm, mostly routine. I'd wake up to the faint chirping of birds, grab a quick breakfast, and spend my afternoons getting things set up in the house. Small repairs, unpacking the last of my boxes, and organizing my new life. The odd noises from the night before seemed to fade into the background, easily dismissed as the house settling. After all, houses like this one were bound to creak. And maybe it was just my nerves from the move, adjusting to the quiet, adjusting to being alone again. But things started to change. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things, subtle enough that I might have ignored them if I weren't already on edge. The temperature in certain rooms would drop unexpectedly, leaving me with a chill that settled deep into my bones. The lights flickered occasionally, casting strange, fleeting shadows across the walls. I started to notice that the floorboards, while creaky, seemed to creak in patterns. Slow, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was walking through the house when I wasn't looking. One evening, I decided to take a walk down the street just to get out of the house and clear my mind. Mrs. Walker's warning still lingered in the back of my mind, but I didn't want to admit that I was starting to feel uneasy. Maybe I was just looking for something to explain the weirdness. It felt like the house itself was watching me, but I pushed that thought away. When I came back, the house was still. Too still. As I unlocked the front door, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. They weren't soft like the house settling. These were heavy, deliberate steps, as though someone was walking toward me. My heart skipped a beat and I froze. I stood in the doorway, staring into the dark hallway, but I saw nothing. I stepped inside, my pulse racing. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello?" No answer. Just silence. I knew it was ridiculous to feel so unsettled, but something in the air felt off. The silence didn't sit right. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like something was lurking just out of sight. I forced myself to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe the house had been empty for too long, and the noises were just the wind or animals outside. But as the evening went on, the strange occurrences began to pile up. I noticed it first when I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The faintest movement just out of the corner of my eye, as though someone, or something, had passed by the doorway. I spun around, but again there was nothing. My nerves were starting to fray, but I told myself to stay calm. It was an old house. Old houses have quirks. But I couldn't deny that a part of me felt like I was being watched, like the walls were pressing in on me, making it harder to breathe. I had to know if I was just imagining it. I needed to understand what was going on. So I decided to talk to Mrs. Walker again. The next morning, I caught her on her front porch, sipping tea in the early sunlight. She looked up as I approached, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what's happening here," I said, my voice more strained than I intended. "There's something in the house. I can feel it. The noises, they're not normal." Her face softened as if she had been expecting this. "I tried to warn you," she said quietly, placing her teacup down on the porch rail. "I don't think you understand what you're dealing with. This house, it's been through a lot. There are things here, things that shouldn't be. It's not just the house settling. And it's not your imagination." I stared at her, waiting for her to continue, but she didn't say anything more. The air between us grew thick with tension. "Do you know anything about the house's history?" I asked. "Who lived here before me?" Mrs. Walker hesitated, looking away for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "The original owner, he was obsessed with the occult. There were rumors, whispers really, that he'd done things here. Rituals, dark things. He might have opened something he shouldn't have. Some say he brought something into this world, something that shouldn't be. And when he left, it didn't leave with him." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean, didn't leave?" She looked me in the eye, her gaze intense. "You'll find it. I'm sure of it. You'll see, there are records. A journal or something like that. The last tenant, she said she found it. It's hidden somewhere in the house. But you need to be careful. Whatever's here doesn't like to be discovered." I couldn't decide if Mrs. Walker was trying to warn me or if she was just a crazy old woman with too much time on her hands. But I knew one thing for sure. I had to find out more. I had to know what was going on in this house. That night I started searching. I combed through every room, every drawer, every closet. It was exhausting and I found nothing. But when I got to the attic, I felt something change. The air up there was thick with dust. and the small window let in only a sliver of light, casting long shadows. The attic was cluttered, filled with old furniture and boxes of things the previous owners had left behind. And that's when I saw it. Half hidden under a pile of old blankets and crates was a small leather-bound book. My hands shook as I reached for it, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was cold to the touch, and when I opened it, the first thing I saw was a strange symbol etched into the inside cover. I turned the pages, scanning the faded handwriting. Rituals, incantations, descriptions of strange happenings, and drawings that made my blood run cold. The last entry was a scrawled mess of words, barely legible, but one part stood out clearly. Asterisk, the door is open. It will never close, asterisk. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. But again there was nothing. Just the sound of my breath, sharp and ragged in the quiet attic. I had found what I was looking for. And now, I knew something far worse was waiting for me. The journal was heavy in my hands, the weight of its contents pressing down on me in ways I couldn't quite explain. The room felt colder as I flipped through its pages, each word more disturbing than the last. The rituals, the symbols, the mention of the door, it was all too much. I shoved the journal into my bag, my mind racing. Asterisk, the door is open. It will never close, asterisk, the words echoed in my head, looping over and over until I felt like I was drowning in them. What did it mean? What door? And what had the previous owners let in? I didn't know how long I stood there trying to make sense of it all. But when I heard the soft creak of the floorboard again, I snapped out of my daze. The sound was different this time. It wasn't just a random creak from the house settling. It was deliberate, almost like someone was standing behind me just out of sight. I turned quickly, heart in my throat, but the attic was empty. Nothing. But the air felt thick, too thick. It pressed against my chest, making it harder to breathe. And then it happened. The attic door, which I was sure had been closed when I entered, creaked open. I froze. No one had been upstairs with me. I was alone. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave the house, never look back, and forget any of this had ever happened. But I couldn't move. Something held me there, something invisible and heavy, like an unseen force pushing me toward the door. My feet moved on their own, carrying me to the entrance. I reached out, my hand trembling as it grasped the doorknob. As soon as I touched it, a coldness spread up my arm like I had grabbed hold of ice. The door opened with a loud, groaning sound, revealing the narrow staircase that led back down to the rest of the house. I stepped back, shaking. But then, as if it was waiting for me to look, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from below. Heavy, slow, methodical. I didn't dare call out. I couldn't. My voice was stuck in my throat, and the only thing I could do was listen to the steady rhythm of the steps that echoed up from the darkness below. I stepped away from the door, backing toward the far corner of the attic. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now. I could practically feel the weight of someone's gaze on my back, but when I turned around, the attic was empty. I didn't know how long I stood there, listening to the footsteps grow louder and louder, but eventually the sound stopped. Silence fell. A dead, suffocating silence. I gathered my courage, but the question that had been nagging at the back of my mind suddenly grew too loud to ignore. Asterisk, what if it was the door? What if it's still open? Asterisk. The thought paralyzed me. The door. I had to know more, but I didn't know how. I bolted from the attic, grabbing the journal and racing down the stairs. The house felt different now, colder, heavier. Every step I took felt like it was leading me deeper into something I couldn't understand. Something I wasn't supposed to find. I rushed through the living room, barely glancing at the shadows that seemed to shift in the corners of the room. My eyes were fixed on the hallway at the door that led to the basement. I'd seen it before, an old wooden door that seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't place. I had never wanted to go down there, but now I felt like I had no choice. The footsteps hadn't stopped even after I left the attic. I could still hear them, slow and deliberate, following me. They seemed to be coming from every direction, closing in on me with each passing second. I reached for the doorknob, and the moment my fingers brushed it, the coldness hit me again, stronger this time, like something was pulling me toward it. It was as if the house itself was beckoning me inside, urging me to open the door. I hesitated, breathing heavily, my mind screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was on the other side. I had to know what I had stumbled into. With shaking hands, I twisted the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a set of steep stairs leading down into the pitch-black basement. I felt my heart race, my pulse pounding in my ears as I stepped forward. Each creak of the floorboards beneath my feet was like a warning, telling me to stop. But I couldn't. I needed answers. As I descended into the basement, the air grew heavier, thick with the smell of earth and decay. The further I went, the colder it became. The walls were covered in damp, dark stains, and the floor was uneven, with chunks of stone sticking out at odd angles. At the bottom of the stairs, I found something that made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of the room, was a wooden door. It was old, worn, and covered in strange symbols, the same ones I had seen in the journal. The symbols seemed to shift and pulse, almost as if they were alive, as though they were waiting for something, or someone. I stood frozen in place, my breath shallow. I had never felt fear like this. It was as though the very air in the basement had changed, taking on a life of its own. And then I heard it, a soft whisper coming from behind the door. It wasn't a voice. It was more like a presence, a feeling, a pressure in the air. But it was unmistakable. It's open. I didn't know what to do. The door felt like the last step, the moment that everything would change. And then I realized something else, something horrible. The footsteps, the coldness, the whispers. They weren't just from the house. They were from beyond the door. The thing that was waiting for me. It had always been waiting. I stepped back, slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. There was no way back now. Whatever I had unleashed, whatever I had found, it was too late to stop. I don't know how long I stood there, my hands still hovering over the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It felt like it was coming from everywhere, filling the room, the house, like the walls were closing in on me. But I didn't move. I couldn't. The fear gripping me was like nothing I had ever experienced. It was primal, instinctual, a deep, gut-wrenching terror that told me, in no uncertain terms, that something unspeakable was waiting behind that door. Something ancient. Something hungry. My breath was shallow, my body rigid. The house had changed. The atmosphere was different now, darker. The air had thickened like it was alive, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I didn't want to open that door. I didn't want to find out what lay beyond it. But part of me knew that I had to. I had already come too far. And the footsteps. They were still there, following me, growing louder with each passing second. With a deep, shaky breath, I turned the doorknob. It gave way with a creak, and the door swung open, revealing the dark void beyond. The basement was even colder than the rest of the house, the chill in the air biting through my skin. I couldn't see anything beyond the first few steps, just a mass of blackness that swallowed the light. But I knew something was down there. I could feel it. The presence. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest, pulling me toward it. I hesitated, my body fighting against the urge to flee. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and run. But I couldn't. The journal, the whispers, the footsteps, they had all led me here. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw something in the darkness. A pair of glowing eyes. They were low to the ground, almost at the level of my feet. They flickered in and out of the shadows like they were trying to hide, but not quite succeeding. The eyes were cold, empty, and they were staring at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to get out of that house before it was too late. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. I couldn't look away from those glowing eyes. Suddenly they blinked. I didn't know what to do. My legs wouldn't move, my body locked in place as if the fear had turned my very bones to stone. The basement seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the shadows shifting, twisting. The air was thick with something wrong. Then, without warning, the eyes vanished. The room went silent. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that maybe the fear had played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I knew what I had seen. I was no longer alone in the basement. I backed away slowly, my heart thumping so loudly I was sure it could be heard in every room of the house. The air was heavier now, as though the darkness had grown thicker, more oppressive. My skin tingled, my senses heightened to a sharp, unbearable intensity. I could feel the house watching me, waiting for something. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, came a sound. A low, guttural growl. It was so deep it shook the very foundation of the building, reverberating through the walls, through the floor beneath my feet. My blood ran cold. I didn't have time to think. I turned and ran, stumbling back up the stairs to the main floor. The footsteps were louder now, following me, closing in on me with every step I took. The house seemed to be alive, its walls groaning, the floorboards creaking, the windows rattling. I burst through the door to the living room, my hands shaking as I slammed it shut behind me. The house fell silent once more, but the fear didn't go away. It clung to me like a second skin, like a presence that wouldn't leave, no matter how hard I tried to shake it. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to leave. But something stopped me. The journal. The door. the eyes. It was all connected. Whatever had been waiting for me, whatever had been lurking in that basement, was tied to this house. And it wasn't done with me yet. I had to find out more. I glanced around the living room, my mind racing, searching for anything that might help me understand what was happening. There had to be something here, something I had missed. I spotted the old fireplace in the corner of the room. The hearth was cold, untouched, but something about it caught my eye. There, tucked in the corner, was a small, worn-out book. I approached it cautiously, my heart still pounding in my chest. I picked it up, dusting off the cover. It was old, older than anything else in the house. The pages were yellowed, brittle with age. I opened it. The pages were filled with the same strange symbols I had seen in the journal. Rituals, occult practices. And then, at the end of the book, was a single page that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a map of the house. At the center of the map was a symbol I didn't recognize, a circle with an intricate pattern inside like a labyrinth. And beneath the symbol were the words, the heart of the house. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to find it. But as I stared at the map, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. The footsteps. They had returned. And this time they were closer. I didn't even need to turn around to know that something was behind me. The cold breath on the back of my neck, the weight of invisible eyes watching me, it was unmistakable. My body was rigid, frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to move, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. The house was alive with a malevolent presence, and I could feel it closing in. I gripped the map tighter, the paper crinkling under my trembling fingers. The heart of the house, what did it mean? Why had I been drawn to it? I didn't know, but there was something about it, some force, some pull that urged me forward, like I had no choice but to find it. The footsteps behind me continued, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was following me was savoring my fear, enjoying the terror that gripped me. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a countdown, a ticking clock, getting closer to something I wasn't prepared to face. I turned around. Nothing. The living room was empty. The air still, heavy with the weight of a silence that felt unnatural. But I knew better than to trust the stillness. The house was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I forced myself to take a step forward, my feet dragging as I walked back toward the hallway. The map was now my only guide. There was no going back. I had to find the heart of the house. It was the only way to understand what was happening, to understand what I was up against. I made my way through the dark hallway, the shadows stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. The house creaked, groaned, and settled around me, but the strange, heavy footsteps had stopped. It was as if whatever had been following me was now waiting, lurking, just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the house with me, something ancient and powerful, something that had been here long before I ever stepped foot in this cursed place. And it wanted me. The map led me down a narrow corridor that I hadn't noticed before. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the floor beneath my feet cracked and uneven. The air was colder here, and the smell was different, musty like old books, and something darker, something I couldn't quite place. I followed the map, my eyes scanning the walls for any indication of what was to come. As I walked deeper into the house, the oppressive feeling grew stronger. I could hear the faint sound of whispers again, echoing through the halls. They were soft at first, barely audible, but as I neared the end of the hallway, they grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from behind a door at the far end of the corridor. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stared at the door, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. Whatever was on the other side, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. With a shaky breath, I opened the door. The room beyond was small, barely more than a closet. It was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt. The air in the room was dense, thick with an oppressive energy that almost made it hard to breathe. In the center of the room was an old, wrought iron door, its surface covered in strange symbols, its edges etched with something that looked like blood. This was it, the heart of the house. I stepped forward, unable to stop myself, drawn to the door as if it were calling to me. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. I reached out, my hand trembling as I placed it on the cold metal of the door. It was like touching ice, like touching death itself. The moment my hand made contact, the whispers stopped. Everything went silent. And then the door creaked open. I stepped through, my heart pounding in my chest. What I found on the other side took my breath away. The room was vast, far larger than I had expected, and it was bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. The walls were covered in strange, ancient symbols, glowing faintly, pulsating as if alive. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, surrounded by candles that flickered despite the lack of wind. The air was thick with the smell of something burning, something foul, something rotten. And there, standing by the altar, was the figure I had been dreading. It was tall, too tall, its form almost humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, twisted, like something not meant to exist in this world. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness, boring into my soul. I froze. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there watching me, waiting. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. My throat was tight, choking on the fear that gripped me. I tried to turn, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like I was trapped in place, caught in the gaze of something far older and more powerful than anything I had ever encountered. The air grew colder still, and I could hear the whispers again, louder now, frantic, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. The figure began to move, slowly, its long, spindly fingers reaching out toward me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But all I could do was watch as the figure closed the distance between us. Its voice was low, a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed. "Now you belong to the house." The words echoed in my mind, a sickening truth sinking in. The house had claimed me, and there was no escaping it now. Suddenly, the world around me began to spin, the walls warping, stretching, distorting. The figure's hand was mere inches from mine, and I felt something cold and sharp press against my skin. And then darkness. I woke up in the hallway, my body lying crumpled against the wall. My mind was foggy, disoriented, as if I had just woken from a terrible dream. But it wasn't a dream. I was still in the house. I didn't know how long I had been out, but everything was different. The whispers had stopped. The house was eerily silent. But the air felt wrong, thick with something I couldn't explain. I had to leave. I had to get out. I scrambled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady, my heart still racing in my chest. But just as I turned to run, I heard it. The footsteps. Slow. Methodical. Coming from behind me. And this time they weren't alone. Something else was with it. Something that had been waiting for me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to escape, to get as far away from that house as possible. But my legs felt like lead, weighed down by something far heavier than just fear. My body wanted to move, but my mind was frozen, paralyzed by the terror creeping up my spine, by the heavy presence that I knew was following me. The footsteps were closer now. I could hear them, slow, deliberate, echoing in the darkness. It wasn't just one set of footsteps anymore. There were multiple. The rhythm was wrong, like a symphony of dissonant, broken notes, each one out of sync with the last. I forced myself to take a step, then another, my heart thundering in my chest. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind trying to process what was happening. The house, the figure, the altar. It was all too much, too fast, too surreal. But I couldn't stop now. I had to keep going. The hallway stretched out before me, longer than it should have been, as if the house itself were twisting, changing, to keep me in its grip. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing, making the air feel thinner, suffocating. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was chasing me. I had to face it, no matter how horrible the truth was. I turned, and I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, the figure stood again, motionless, as if it had been waiting for me to turn around. Its tall, impossibly thin form towered over the shadows, its limbs impossibly long, stretching into the darkness, as if it wasn't entirely part of this world. It wasn't the same as before. This time, there was something more to it. Something alive, something moving just beneath its surface, like the skin of the house itself was crawling with dark, malevolent energy. The whispers were louder now, flooding my mind. They weren't words, not exactly, more like a low hum, a chant that scraped against my consciousness, pulling me in, tempting me to listen. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the sound. The footsteps were behind me again, closing in. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out everything else. I turned back to the figure, desperate to understand what it was, why it was here, why it was following me. And that's when I saw it. The doorway, the one I had passed before, the one that had seemed so familiar, so inviting, yet I hadn't dared to enter. The door was open now. A sickeningly familiar cold draft poured from the room beyond, chilling my bones. The air in the hallway grew even colder, but this cold was different. It wasn't just temperature. It was a presence, an icy grip on my soul. I stumbled toward the open door, almost against my will, my body moving on its own, pulled by the force of something I couldn't resist. The whispers were louder now, clearer. I could almost make out the words. "Come closer. Come inside. It's too late for you now. The door creaked as I approached, its hinges groaning under the weight of something ancient and forgotten. The room beyond was darker than the hallway, the shadows thick and suffocating. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I could feel the presence of something ancient in the air, thick with the scent of decay and old rituals. I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. My body jerked forward, and I found myself stumbling deeper into the room, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The air inside was so cold it burned, sharp and biting, like it had been preserved for centuries. I couldn't see anything, not really. It was like the darkness itself had swallowed the room whole. But I could hear something. Movement. Low, dragging sounds like something, or someone, shuffling across the floor. I tried to move, to run, but my feet were frozen to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then I heard it. A voice. It was low, like a growl, but also a whisper too quiet to understand. I strained to hear it, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it. The voice was familiar somehow. Sounded like mine. But that couldn't be possible. I hadn't spoken. The voice came again. You shouldn't have come. It was my voice, but not my words. It was a distorted version of myself, speaking to me from the darkness, from the heart of the house. I was trapped. There was no escape. The house had taken me, and now it was feeding on my fear, on my confusion, twisting me into something that wasn't quite human anymore. The whispers started again, now in unison, a chorus of voices speaking from every corner of the room. Their words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, cruel, and full of ancient malice. And then something moved in the darkness. I didn't see it at first, but I felt it. A shift in the air. A presence crawling toward me, its footsteps silent but unmistakable. It was there, behind me, closing in, its breath hot against my neck. I turned around, but I couldn't see anything. Nothing. The room had changed. It was no longer just a room, it had become something else. Something alive. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself were breathing, alive and aware of my every move. The shadows in the corners stretched, shifting and twisting as if they were reaching for me. The presence was closing in, its form taking shape, becoming more solid, more real. I felt it pressing against me, its cold fingers brushing against my skin. And then I heard the voice again. Leave now. I didn't wait for the rest of the words. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran through the dark, through the suffocating silence, the house groaning and creaking around me, the shadows chasing me, clawing at me. I could hear them behind me, their whispers, their cold laughter, growing louder, closer. But no matter how fast I ran, the house wouldn't let me go. I could hear it, feel it, closing in on me. The walls seemed to shift, the floorboards creaking underfoot, guiding me deeper into its heart. The darkness swallowed me whole. And then everything went silent. The house was gone. I woke up outside. But the fear didn't leave. I woke with a jolt, my body drenched in cold sweat. My heart hammered in my chest as if the nightmare had never ended. The sunlight pouring through the cracked curtains of my car window only made everything feel more surreal, like I had never left the house, like the terror of the night had followed me into the daylight. I didn't know how I had ended up in the car. 1 minute I was running through the suffocating darkness of the house, and the next I was here, parked on the side of the road as if I had been asleep for hours or days. I tried to shake the lingering feeling of dread, the cold chill still gripping my bones. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, the metal cold against my skin. I stepped outside, the air crisp and fresh, a sharp contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside that house. But it wasn't enough to clear the fog in my mind. I felt disoriented, lost, like I had woken up from a dream that wasn't quite over. I stood there for a long time, staring at the house in the distance. The old place had been a strange, horrifying presence, but it was still there, looming. And somehow, I knew I would never truly leave. My legs carried me, almost of their own accord, toward the house. As I approached, the nagging feeling returned, the same fear, the same overwhelming sense of something unfinished, something left behind. The whispers had faded, but they had never really left me. The neighbor across the street was outside, tending to her garden. Her eyes flicked up when she saw me, and I could almost see the recognition in her expression, the quiet pity in her gaze. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. I knew what she was thinking. She had seen it all before. I didn't expect you to come back, she said finally, her voice low and cautious. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? That the house had called to me, that it had pulled me back into its darkness? I didn't believe it myself. But there I was, standing in front of it again, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. I couldn't leave, I muttered, the words feeling hollow even as I spoke them. She looked at me with an unreadable expression, then shook her head slowly. You know what happened to the last person who tried to leave, don't you? I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? She hesitated for a moment, glancing at the house as if it were listening, then stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. There was another one years ago. Came here, lived in that house for a few months. Everything was fine, or at least it seemed like it. But one day he just ran out in the middle of the night, screaming like a maniac, babbling about curses. He didn't last long after that. He was never the same. I stared at her, heart racing. My mind flashed back to the figure in the darkness, to the whispers, the cold air, the feeling of being watched, hunted. What happened to him? She shrugged, her eyes flicking away. No one knows. Some say he just left town, disappeared. Others say he's in a hospital now, locked away. But no one ever saw him the same after that night. They say whatever it was that took him, it never really let go. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Her words echoed in my mind, sinking into my thoughts like a splinter. Could I be the next one? Would I, too, run out of that house, screaming, babbling about curses I didn't understand? I tried to shake the thought away, but it lingered. I turned to walk back toward the house, my feet heavy with dread. There was no going back now. I needed to understand what had happened to me, why this place had such a hold on me, why it felt like I was a part of it, like it was a part of me. As I reached the front door, I paused, feeling the weight of it. The house seemed to breathe around me, the air thick and oppressive. I could hear the faintest whisper of movement inside, like the house itself was alive, waiting. The door creaked open on its own, as if inviting me back in. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness welcomed me just as it always had. But something was different this time. The air was still cold, but there was a strange, almost comforting presence in the house now, like it had been waiting for me to return. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I moved through the hallway, the sounds of the house settling around me. It was the same yet different. The walls seemed to watch me, the shadows longer, more oppressive. I walked past the room where I had encountered the figure, the cold draft still seeping out from under the door. It was locked now, but I could feel the presence beyond it, like a beating heart just out of reach. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to see what was behind that door. With trembling hands, I turned the handle. The door opened slowly, the hinges protesting as it swung wide. Inside, the room was dark, but I could see something faint, like a figure standing in the center of the room, just out of the corner of my eye. I stepped inside, my breath shallow. The room felt even colder than before, the air thick with the scent of something old, something decayed. And there, in the center of the room, was the altar. It was the same but different. The symbols, the markings, the faint remnants of something sinister, it was all still there. But now, it was as though the room was alive with a strange energy, a presence I couldn't fully comprehend. I stepped closer, my hands reaching out, drawn to it, despite every instinct telling me to run. And that's when I heard it. A voice, whispering my name. It was low, familiar, but twisted, like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. It was a voice I recognized but couldn't place. It called to me again. And then the room went dark. I snapped my eyes open, heart pounding. My breathing was ragged, and I felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. For a moment, I thought I was still in that room, the one with the altar, the voice calling my name, but then I realized I was back in my own bed, tangled in the sheets, sweat soaking my skin. I sat up, the room spinning around me as I tried to get my bearings. The familiar creak of the house seemed louder now, more pronounced, as if the walls were groaning under some unseen weight. I looked around, trying to shake the remnants of the dream, or whatever it had been, out of my head, but nothing felt normal anymore. The silence in the house was suffocating, but it wasn't the quiet I had grown used to. It was thick, unnatural. I swung my legs off the bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor, and stood. The house was still, but I could feel something lurking just beneath the surface. It was like the house itself was waiting for something to happen. I could almost hear it breathing with me. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was just past midnight. I had been asleep for a few hours, but it didn't feel like it. Time seemed to stretch and bend in this place like it was an illusion. The air was thick with a sense of dread, like the atmosphere had changed overnight. I could feel it in my bones. The house wasn't the same anymore. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain, peering outside into the darkness. The street was empty, the only sound the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. It was so quiet, so still, but somehow it only made everything feel more off. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw something. In the reflection of the glass, a shadow moved across the room behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, the cold grip of fear tightening around my throat. I wasn't imagining things. Something was here with me. I looked toward the door to the hallway. It was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peek through. My instincts screamed at me to stay where I was, to hide, to leave. But something kept pulling me forward, something that I couldn't explain, like the house was calling me back. I took a hesitant step toward the door. The floorboards creaked under my weight and I froze. I could feel the presence in the house, surrounding me, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. The air was thick with it, a tension that made my skin crawl. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The hallway stretched before me, shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. The house seemed to exhale as if it were waking up with me. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, the silence almost unbearable. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping of my heart and the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. I reached the staircase and hesitated. The upper floors loomed above me, dark and foreboding. I had never ventured up there after that first night. The fear that gripped me then still clung to me now. But something, some unspoken force, urged me on. I began to climb the stairs, each step creaking loudly in the quiet. My legs felt like lead, my breath shallow and fast. As I reached the top, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping as if something in the house was sucking all the warmth away. I turned toward the hallway, where the bedroom doors stood in dark, silent rows. I had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable than I did right now. And then I saw it. The door at the end of the hall, the one that had always been locked, was now slightly ajar. The faintest sliver of light leaked from the crack, a sickly yellow glow that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I couldn't breathe. I moved closer, my feet dragging across the floor, my eyes fixed on that door, that light. I didn't know what awaited me behind it, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know. The air grew colder with each step. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The metal was icy, like it had been frozen for years. I turned the handle. The door creaked open. Inside, the room was as dark as the rest of the house, but the light, this faint, sickly glow, came from something on the floor, a low, pulsing light that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. I stepped inside, the door shutting behind me with a heavy thud. The silence was suffocating, the air thick with something old and decayed. My heart hammered in my chest as I walked toward the source of the light. The floorboards in the center of the room were cracked, and there, in the middle of the room, was a large, circular symbol drawn in faded red paint. The light seemed to emanate from it, a soft glow that pulsed rhythmically as though alive. I knelt down, my hands shaking, and reached for the floorboards. I pulled at them, my fingers slipping against the old, rotting wood. But then something stopped me. A cold breath on the back of my neck. I froze. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in the air. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I slowly turned around, my heart racing in my chest. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A shadow, indistinct and flickering in and out of focus, like it couldn't quite decide if it was real. I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It took a step forward, and with it, the air seemed to compress, like the house itself was closing in on me. The figure moved closer, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't move. And then the whisper came. It was the same voice from the dream. The same voice that had called my name. It whispered, low and sinister, right into my ear. "Welcome back." And just like that, the room went dark. I don't know how long I stood there in the dark, frozen in place, unable to move or even scream. My mind was a jumble of terror and disbelief. The air felt thick, almost like it was pressing in on me, suffocating every breath I tried to take. The cold that had surrounded me earlier now felt like ice, creeping through my skin, biting into my very bones. My body wouldn't respond. My legs were paralyzed, rooted to the floor as if the house itself had decided that I was never leaving. The figure in the doorway loomed in my peripheral vision, an indistinct blur that flickered and shifted like it was struggling to remain tangible. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything that should exist in the real world. The whisper came again, cold and deliberate. "Welcome back." That voice. I knew it. I had heard it before, everywhere. In the dream, in the house, in the dark corners of my mind. It was the same voice that had called to me when I first moved in, when I first started hearing the footsteps, the whispers in the night. It was the voice that had led me here to this very moment. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I did. My legs finally obeyed and I backed away, stumbling over the cracks in the floor. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, the shadow that seemed to stretch and shift like it was made of pure darkness. But I had to escape. I had to get out of here. I turned, my feet finally finding purchase beneath me, and I bolted for the door. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, every step echoing through the house. But as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't get a good grip. The cold from the room seemed to have reached out and wrapped itself around the door, locking it in place. "No," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. "No, no, no." I pulled harder, my fingers slipping against the cold metal. It felt like the entire house was closing in on me, like it was trapping me here, in this room with whatever had been lurking in the shadows. The house didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to stay. The air was suffocating, the pressure in my chest so intense I thought I might collapse. Panic surged through me, my mind racing for an escape, any escape. The figure in the doorway took another step forward, and I could feel its presence, oppressive and cold. I knew if I stayed here, if I didn't escape, I would never leave this place. I would be just another name, another whisper lost in the house's history. With one final desperate pull, the door swung open and I was free. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran, my feet pounding against the floor, the sound of my own breath a deafening roar in my ears. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The house seemed to groan as I moved through it, the walls creaking and cracking as though it was angry that I was leaving. The hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long, like it was mocking me, reminding me that I was still trapped in its web. But I didn't care. I just kept running, my mind only focused on getting out, on finding the door that would lead me to safety. The stairs loomed ahead, but I didn't slow down. I took them two at a time, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath ragged and shallow. As I reached the bottom, I saw the front door, bathed in moonlight, just a few feet away. The light seemed so far, like a beacon of hope, and I pushed myself harder, faster. But as my hand touched the doorknob, something stopped me. A cold breath against my neck. A whisper in my ear. "Don't go." I froze. My fingers clenched around the doorknob, but I couldn't move. The voice, the same voice, echoed in my mind, filling my ears, my thoughts, my soul. It wasn't just the house. It was inside me now. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please let me leave." But the house wouldn't let go. It had me now. I could feel it wrapping its tendrils around me, pulling me back into the darkness. The door refused to open. It was like the house itself was alive, watching me, waiting for me to succumb. The temperature dropped, the cold settling deep into my skin. I felt a weight on my chest, as though something was pressing down on me, keeping me there, trapped between the house and whatever was lurking inside it. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure eased. The door swung open and I stumbled forward, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran into the night, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to leave, had to get as far away from that house as possible. I didn't stop until I reached the town, until I could hear the sound of cars in the distance and see the faint glow of streetlights. The house was behind me now, its shadow stretching far behind, but even then I could still feel its presence, like it was following me. I haven't been back since. I moved into a new apartment, far from that cursed place. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the silence presses in around me, I hear it. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold breath against my neck. I don't know if it's real. I don't know if it's just my mind, still trapped in that house, still haunted by the things I saw. But I hear it, and I'm still afraid. Because I know whatever haunted that house isn't gone. It's still out there, and it's waiting for the next person to move in. It's been months since I left the house, but the weight of it still lingers in my life, like an invisible chain wrapped around my chest. I thought I'd escape. I thought moving to a new town, a new apartment, would finally put an end to the terror that house had caused me. But it hasn't. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the hallways of my apartment. When I sit up, heart racing, I try to convince myself it's just the pipes or maybe the neighbors. After all, old buildings creak, right? But the footsteps sound too deliberate, too real. The last time it happened, I got up and checked every corner, every room. Nothing. The worst part? The worst part is that it feels the same as the house. That same oppressive atmosphere, the same chill that creeps under my skin and makes my heart thud so loudly in my ears. It feels like whatever was in that house followed me here, like it's somehow connected to me, tethered to my very being. I haven't told anyone about what happened in the house. Not a single person. I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy. That they'll think I'm making it all up, that it was just stress or a bad dream. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. and no one can convince me otherwise. I tried to go to a therapist once, just to talk, to get it all off my chest. The first session went well. I spoke about the move, about how things were different in the new place, how I thought I'd left the past behind. But when I mentioned the house, the way it felt so alive, so suffocating, she looked at me with pity in her eyes. I stopped talking. I never went back. But I can't stop thinking about it. The house, the curse, the whispers. The house's history, it's been eating at me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I did some research online. I don't know why I thought I could find any answers, but I had to know, had to understand. The more I dug, the more twisted the story became. The house was built in the 1800s, a time when occult practices were all the rage among the wealthy. The original owner, a man named Thomas Graves, was a self-proclaimed occultist. He believed in opening doors, portals to other worlds, other dimensions. His journals were filled with ritualistic symbols, strange incantations, and references to something called the other side. I found an old newspaper article from the early 1900s. It described the house as uninhabitable after a series of disappearances in the area. People had run out of the house in the dead of night, claiming to hear voices, see figures in the windows, feel cold spots that burned like ice. One man, his name was John Whitaker, had been the last to live there. He had been found babbling incoherently in the streets, speaking about a curse, about the eyes. He died in a mental institution a few days later, never regaining his sanity. The more I read, the more the pieces started to fall into place. It wasn't just the house, it was something else, something evil that Thomas Graves had called forth when he dabbled in things he couldn't understand. And that evil? It was still there. I think it's what's following me now. I keep hearing it, these whispers in the dark. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me, but now I'm not so sure. Last night, I heard it clearer than ever. The voice. The same voice that had whispered to me in the house. "Come back," it said, a low murmur, so close I could feel the words against my skin. "You belong here." I thought I was losing my mind. I almost convinced myself it was just the stress of everything, the new apartment, the new job, the loneliness, but deep down, I know it's something else. I thought about going back to the house, to face whatever it was, to see if the answers I was looking for were still there. But I can't. Not after everything that happened. The house had tried to keep me. It had tried to swallow me whole. And the last thing I need is to go back and let it finish what it started. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That whatever it was, whatever I encountered in that house, is still waiting for me. It's following me. It's inside my head, in my dreams. I can't escape it. I know what I have to do. I have to confront it, to go back to the house and end it. I don't know how, but I know I can't keep running. Because as much as I want to ignore it, as much as I want to move on, I can feel it in my bones. It's never going to let me go. And the worst part? I think the house is calling me back. I don't think I'll ever be free. The moment I decided to go back, I felt something shift inside me, like a door creaking open. I thought I had buried the past, locked it away, but it never truly left. It's as if the house has been waiting for me, silently biding its time, ready to drag me back into its depths. I couldn't ignore the whispers any longer. "Come back," they would say, each time louder, more insistent. The voice was growing more familiar, like an old friend I had once known and forgotten. It was beckoning me. And I just knew, that if I didn't go, I'd lose whatever part of myself still felt human. The plan was simple. Go to the house, face whatever haunted me, and figure out once and for all what was pulling me back. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't even know if I'd make it out again. But something inside me told me that the answers, the truth, lay behind that rotting door. When I arrived, the house looked as it always had. Old, forgotten, decaying. The ivy that once crawled along its brick exterior was now twisted and withered, as though even the earth was trying to abandon it. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring back at me, waiting. I stood there for a long time before I moved. I could feel the air shifting around me, thickening, almost like a tangible presence was pressing against my skin. It was like I was being drawn in, compelled to step closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I placed my hand on the front door. It felt cold to the touch, like a warning, but I didn't hesitate. I pushed it open, and the familiar smell of mildew and decay hit me like a slap. The house didn't smell different, no fresher, no cleaner. It was still the same as when I left. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped inside, the echo of my footsteps sending a chill down my spine. The house groaned, settling into my presence as if it was aware of me, waiting. I tried to keep my breath steady, but it came in shallow gasps. The air felt heavier than before, pressing against my chest. It was colder too. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't help. The cold sank deeper, chilling me to the bone. I made my way through the hall, past the staircase that seemed to loom over me like a dark sentinel. The walls were still covered in the same peeling wallpaper, the same cracked paint. The silence was deafening. Every step I took seemed to echo through the emptiness, mocking me, reminding me of how alone I truly was in this place. I had to find the journal. The one I knew would have the answers. The one I had seen in my research, the one Thomas Graves had kept. I couldn't shake the thought that it was the key to everything. The upstairs was just as I remembered it. Each room was dark, shrouded in shadow, but the one at the end of the hallway, the one where I had seen that dark figure, was different. There was something in the air around it, something thick and suffocating. The door was cracked open just slightly, like it was waiting for me. I pushed it open, the hinges protesting loudly, and stepped inside. The room was just as cold as the rest of the house, but there was something else. Something more. The air was heavier here, charged with an energy I couldn't describe. The desk was still there, cluttered with old papers and books, but the journal, the one I needed, was sitting right on top, almost as if it had been placed there for me to find. It was old, bound in cracked leather, the pages yellowed with age. The moment I touched it, I felt a jolt, a sharp, electric pulse shoot through me. It was like the house had recognized my touch, like it was alive, aware. I opened the journal carefully, my hands trembling, and began to read. The first few pages were mundane, filled with Thomas Graves' thoughts on his occult practices. He was obsessed, consumed by the idea of opening portals to the other side, of communicating with beings beyond our world. But then, as I read deeper, things took a darker turn. The rituals grew more intense, more disturbing. The language became strange, almost nonsensical, as though he was losing his grip on reality. He wrote about something called the Gate, a doorway to a realm that he could feel pressing against the fabric of our world. A realm where the laws of nature didn't apply, where time and space were twisted, where the dead could walk among the living. As I read, the temperature in the room dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air now, misting in front of me. And that's when I heard it, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I turned back to the journal, forcing myself to focus, to keep reading. But I could feel it, the presence just behind me, watching, waiting. I could almost hear its breath, feel its cold fingers brushing against my neck. The final pages were the most disturbing of all. Thomas wrote about the eyes that watched him from the darkness, about how he could hear them, feel them, always following him. And then, in a frenzied scrawl, he wrote, *, I've opened it. The gate is open. It cannot be closed now. They are here. They have found me. I can hear them in the walls, in the floorboards. They are waiting for you, *. The journal slipped from my hands, crashing to the floor with a thud. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest as I realized the terrifying truth. The gate. The thing that had been summoned all those years ago was still here, still waiting. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. It was a conduit, a doorway. And I had walked right through it. The floor beneath me creaked again, louder this time. I could hear it, feel it, the slow, deliberate steps coming closer, closing in. The air around me grew colder, suffocatingly cold. And then I heard a voice, so soft, so close it was almost a whisper in my ear. Come closer. I turned, but the room was empty. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, suffocating. And then I felt it. Something cold, heavy, like the weight of 1,000 eyes, pressing down on me. Something was sitting on the bed behind me, its presence undeniable, suffocating. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. I ran out of the room, down the stairs, through the dark hallways, out the door. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. But even as I drove away, I could hear the footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, like they were following me. I couldn't escape. The house was still there. And whatever waited inside was still watching. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The moment I stepped out of that house, I thought I had left the horror behind me, but the fear never truly left. It lingered like a shadow, following me wherever I went. The silence in my apartment felt too quiet, too empty, as though the house had reached into my life, stretching its dark fingers into every corner. I told myself I was safe, that I had left the house behind, but my mind refused to believe it. The cold air that had pressed against my skin, the whispering voices, the feeling of something always watching. Those sensations were with me now, deep in my bones. It was as if the house had become a part of me, living inside my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear it, the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears, the panic still fresh, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. But then it came again, slow and measured. the distinct sound of something heavy dragging its feet across a floor. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I looked around the room, half expecting to see the shadows from the house creeping into my space, filling it with their darkness. But nothing was there. The room was still. Still, the footsteps persisted. Louder now, closer, as though they were coming for me. I threw the blankets off and bolted out of bed, rushing to the living room. My breath came in short bursts, the room spinning as I moved. The footsteps, so loud now, echoed around me. They were in the walls, under the floorboards. Everywhere. I grabbed my phone, dialing the number of the only person who might understand. My neighbor, Miriam. She had always been strange, kept to herself, never really spoke about the house. But I knew she knew something. The phone rang, and as it did, the footsteps stopped. Dead silence. Miriam answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded distant, almost tired. "You're still hearing them, aren't you?" I froze. How could she know? "They never stop," she continued, her voice low, as if she was speaking from experience. "The house doesn't let go that easily. You should have left when you had the chance. It's too late now. The gate is still open. It doesn't close. It never does." I felt a coldness creeping up my spine, a chill that seeped into my bones. I wanted to scream, to ask her what she meant, but the words caught in my throat. "The footsteps you hear," she said softly, "they're coming from inside you now. The house, it doesn't just haunt the walls. It haunts you. It follows you." I couldn't speak. I could hear it, faintly at first, then growing louder, something moving in the walls, scratching, clawing. The footsteps were back, but now they were inside. My breath came in ragged gasps. Miriam's voice seemed to blur, as if the phone was pulling away from my ear, the connection fading. "Leave. Get out of there. While you still can." But it was too late. The phone went dead. I stood there in the middle of my living room, paralyzed with fear. The footsteps were everywhere. They were inside my own skin now. I could feel them, crawling beneath my flesh, as though the house had infected me, taken root in my soul. The air grew heavier, suffocating. The whispers started again, not from the walls, but from within me. "Come back," they whispered, their voices inescapable. "Come back to us." I turned, instinctively looking toward the door, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. The shadows seemed to stretch, crawling across the room, warping the space around me. And then I saw it. From the corner of my eye, a figure, tall, dark, and cloaked in shadow, moved in the doorway. Its presence was overwhelming, like the weight of 1,000 souls pressing against me. The room grew colder still, my breath visible in the frigid air. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel it. The same thing I had felt back at the house. It was here. It had followed me. And it wasn't leaving. I tried to move, tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its icy breath on my neck. The whispering voices were deafening now, all around me, pressing in, demanding my attention. The footsteps were louder than ever, now pounding in my skull, overwhelming my senses. "Come back," it said, its voice deep and hollow. "You belong to us." The last thing I remember was the cold, an unrelenting, suffocating cold, crawling over my skin, creeping into my lungs until I couldn't breathe. Then nothing. When I woke, I was outside. The sun was setting, casting a blood-red light across the horizon. I didn't know how I got there. My mind was blank, empty, like I had been wiped clean. But I could still hear the footsteps. They were far away now, but they were there. I knew they would always be there. And I knew the house would never let me go. The gate was still open, waiting for the next person to come through. Waiting for its next victim. I tried to forget. I tried to live. But every night as I lay in bed, I heard them. The footsteps. The whispers. And I knew. It was never over. Story 3. I wasn't expecting much from the old house. It was cheap, in a town I barely knew, and that's all I could afford after everything fell apart. The divorce was still fresh, the remnants of my old life scattered between boxes in the back of my car. A change of scenery seemed like the best thing to do. The small town had a quiet charm, but nothing about it felt like home. The house was on the edge of town, a faded yellow two-story with an overgrown yard. The windows were cracked in places, and the front porch sagged just a little too much. When I first pulled up, I felt a small knot in my stomach, something I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like an uneasy anticipation, like walking into a room where something was watching you, even though no one was there. I rang the doorbell, my finger lingering on the button for a moment too long, as if waiting for the answer that would come. The landlord, a tall, thin man with greasy hair and a pinched face, answered after a few moments. His smile was stiff, almost forced. "You're here for the house," he said, his voice low, as if he were stating a fact rather than asking a question. "Yeah, I am," I replied, forcing a smile, but the truth was I didn't know much about the place other than it was affordable. "I'll take it. Looks good enough." He eyed me like he was deciding whether to tell me something, and then, with a shrug, handed me the keys. "You might hear things at night," he said casually. "Creaking floors, the house settling. Some say it's just the wind. But, well, just be careful." "Careful?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. He didn't elaborate, only giving me a half-hearted wave as he turned and disappeared back into the house. I stood there for a moment, watching the door slowly close behind him, feeling an odd chill crawl up my spine. What did he mean by that? The first few days went by uneventfully. I spent most of my time unpacking, trying to organize my life in this unfamiliar space. The house was as creaky as expected. The floorboards groaned under my weight, the windows rattled in the wind, and the occasional draft made me shiver despite the warmth of the weather outside. It was an old house, sure, but nothing too strange. I met a neighbor on my third day, a woman named Margaret. She was in her 60s, with graying hair and a constant smile that made her seem almost too eager. She brought over a casserole dish, which despite my best efforts I accepted. "So, you're the new tenant at the old Johnson place," she said between mouthfuls of food. "It's a nice house, but, well, there are some things you should know." I raised an eyebrow, my curiosity growing. "Things?" Margaret lowered her voice, glancing at the house over her shoulder as if the walls themselves might be listening. It's been a bit cursed, you might say. People have come and gone from that house over the years, but they never really seem to last. Some of them leave in a hurry, others don't leave at all." I laughed awkwardly, thinking she was just exaggerating for effect. "What do you mean? Cursed?" Margaret didn't laugh. "Strange things happen there. Footsteps when no one's around. Cold spots. Things moving around on their own. The last guy who lived there, he ran out in the middle of the night. Poor thing was babbling about voices in the walls. Couldn't get him to talk about it after that. I tried to play it off, but the thought lingered in my mind as I watched Margaret retreat back to her house. Could it all just be rumors? People get lonely in small towns, and sometimes they make up stories to entertain themselves. But why did it feel so unsettling? The next few nights I started hearing it. At first I thought it was just the house. Creaking floorboards. Pipes groaning in the walls. But then there were footsteps, heavy and slow, pacing back and forth in the hallway above me. The first time I heard them, I sat frozen in bed, my heart racing. I told myself it was just the house settling. Just old wood and brick, nothing more. But the sounds didn't stop. They came again the next night and the night after that. I got up to investigate once, but the hallway was empty, silent. The air was colder than usual, though, and the floor felt oddly damp beneath my feet, like someone had spilled water in the middle of the night. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. After all, it was an old house. These things happened. But each night, the footsteps grew louder, closer. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt the air grow even colder. My breath came out in short, sharp gasps as a cold hand seemed to brush against my face. I shot upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty. The house was still. But I could feel it. Something was there. Something that shouldn't be. The next morning, I could hardly shake the feeling of being watched. The coldness in the room had lingered, clinging to my skin as if it had seeped into my very bones. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a bad night's sleep. I had been feeling a little on edge lately. Maybe the divorce had left me more vulnerable than I thought. I was unpacking some boxes in the kitchen when I heard the neighbor's door creak open. Margaret appeared, holding a basket of freshly baked bread. Her usual smile was gone, replaced with a look of concern. "You didn't sleep well last night, did you?" she asked, her eyes scanning the house behind me. I froze. "What do you mean?" Margaret's lips pressed together in a tight line. "I didn't mean to alarm you, but I know what it's like when you're new to that house. You're still adjusting to the old place, right?" "Yeah, I guess," I replied, forcing a chuckle, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling gnawing at my insides. "It's just an old house. The floors creak, the pipes groan. That's all." She nodded slowly, then lowered her voice to a near whisper. "People say it's the house. There's something in the walls. Something that doesn't want you there. You're not the first one to hear things." I didn't know how to respond. The bread, which she had offered so casually, suddenly felt like a gesture of pity. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows of my house. Something I couldn't see but could feel. "Be careful," she added, her tone shifting to something darker. "The last tenant, he didn't just hear things. He saw things. That house. It's never been right. Margaret's words hung in the air, making my skin crawl. I watched her leave, the strange sense of dread following her out the door. I had to know more. If I stayed here, I needed to understand what was going on, what I was dealing with. That night, I decided to search the house. I had spent so much time avoiding the things I didn't understand, but I couldn't run from this anymore. The house had already started making me question my own sanity, and if there was anything I could do to make sense of it, I had to find it. I started with the attic. The narrow, creaky staircase leading up there had always made me uneasy, but now it felt like the only place that could hold answers. The door to the attic was hidden behind an old bookshelf, and as I moved it aside, I felt a weight in the air. The dust settled around me as I pushed open the door, and the dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the space. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten relics of past tenants. As I moved deeper into the room, something caught my eye, a small leather-bound journal, tucked away beneath a pile of old newspapers. The cover was cracked and worn, and when I opened it, I realized it wasn't a diary but a record. A detailed account of strange occurrences. The journal belonged to the house's original owner, someone named Thomas Harding. According to his entries, the house had been a project. A way to escape the world, to bury himself in something darker. He spoke of rituals, of trying to open a door to another world, a place where things beyond the ordinary could be controlled. I skimmed through the pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. Harding's obsession with the occult had started small, with books and symbols, but it quickly escalated. He described nights spent chanting in the dark, drawing strange sigils on the floor, hoping to summon something, someone. The entries grew more erratic as he mentioned hearing voices, seeing shadows that weren't his own. And in his final, frantic scribbles, he wrote about opening something he shouldn't have, something that had crossed over into his world. A doorway, a tear in reality that had let something in. I could hardly breathe as I read the last few lines, where Harding spoke of hearing footsteps in the walls, feeling cold hands brushing his skin. He mentioned running, escaping the house in the dead of night, but not before leaving a warning. Asterisk, it will wait. It always waits, and it will come for the next one. Asterisk. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The footsteps, the cold spots, the strange sensations, all of it. It had all been connected to something more sinister than just an old house. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. The air grew heavy as I closed the journal, the weight of its words sinking in. I had to leave, but something held me in place. The footsteps in the walls, the cold touch on my skin, they weren't just in my head. I wasn't imagining it. Something had been here before, and it wasn't ready to let go. I left the attic in a hurry, but as I descended the stairs, I heard something new. A faint, distant sound, almost like whispering, coming from the walls. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The walls weren't just creaking. They were alive. I had to get out of here. The house was no longer a home, it was a trap, and whatever haunted it was waiting for me to make a mistake. To stay too long. To invite it in. But it was too late. It had already found me. I didn't sleep that night. Even though my body ached for rest, my mind was too tangled in the web of fear and curiosity that had taken hold. The journal in my hands, its unsettling words still fresh in my mind, kept me awake. I knew I had to leave the house, but something inside me resisted. Maybe it was the price of leaving everything behind, or perhaps it was the idea that the house had already become a part of me. I sat in the dark, the house eerily silent except for the occasional groan of the floorboards, the house's natural settling. But then, just as I began to nod off, I heard it again. The whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls, from the very structure of the house itself. I shot up from the couch, heart pounding, my body frozen in place. The whispering continued, growing louder, but always in a language I couldn't understand. My breath hitched as I tried to follow the sound, but the more I focused, the more it seemed to slip away as if it was just beyond my reach. I grabbed a flashlight, my fingers trembling as I flicked it on. The beam of light barely cut through the darkness, but it was enough to show me the walls, old, cracked, and covered in peeling paint. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? The stress of moving, the isolation, the recent divorce? Or was it something more? I moved cautiously through the house, following the whispering as it seemed to change direction. It led me to the hallway, then toward the stairwell that descended into the basement. The air grew thicker with each step, and a coldness settled into my bones. I didn't want to go down there. I didn't want to face whatever was pulling me in, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached the top of the basement stairs and shone the flashlight down into the darkness. There was no sound, no sign of movement, but the whispering was louder now, more insistent, like a voice calling from the depths below. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a hesitant step down, the floor creaking beneath me, the cold air wrapping around me like an invisible hand. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement stretched out before me, dimly lit by the flickering light of the flashlight. It was mostly empty, save for old boxes and forgotten furniture, but there was something unsettling about the space. The walls seemed to close in, pressing in on me, and the temperature was so cold I could see my breath in the air. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I turned slowly, scanning the room. That's when I saw it. At the far corner of the basement, near a stack of old crates, there was a doorway. A small wooden door that I hadn't noticed before. It was half open, and the air around it seemed heavier, as if something was waiting just behind it. The whispering was louder now, no longer a soft murmur but a clear, undeniable voice, screeching and desperate, calling me closer. I tried to step back, my legs refusing to move, but something pulled me toward it. The door beckoned and I couldn't resist. I moved toward it slowly, my heart in my throat, my hands clammy. The closer I got, the more I could feel the air around me growing colder, denser, like the house itself was holding its breath. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I touched the handle, and for a brief moment I hesitated. But then the whispering stopped. It was a deafening silence that hit me like a blow. The stillness was worse than the noise, worse than the whispers that had been gnawing at my sanity for days. I pushed the door open, my breath shallow as I peered inside. The room beyond was small, smaller than I expected, and filled with dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room there was a faded rug, its edges frayed, the pattern worn down with time. But what caught my attention wasn't the room itself, it was the symbol painted on the floor beneath the rug. It was a circle. A large, intricate circle, drawn in what looked like dried blood. The design was twisted, filled with symbols and runes I couldn't recognize. I took a step back, my pulse quickening as my mind scrambled to understand what I was seeing. This was no ordinary room, it was a place for something far darker. The cold was suffocating now, and I could feel the weight of the air pressing in on me like the room itself was alive. I could almost hear the walls creaking, groaning as if they were trying to warn me to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But I couldn't move. The door slammed shut behind me with a violent thud, and I spun around, my flashlight falling from my hand. The light flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. For a moment I thought I saw something in the corner of the room, something moving, too fast, too strange to be real. Then I felt it. A presence. A cold, oppressive force that seemed to surround me, pushing in on all sides. My chest tightened and I gasped for air, but it felt like the very air was being sucked out of the room. I stumbled back toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, sealed from the other side. And then I heard it, footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps. They came from behind me, slow and deliberate. I froze, unable to move as the sound grew louder, closer. The footsteps stopped just behind me and I could feel it. Whatever it was right there watching me. Suddenly, I wasn't alone in that room anymore. I could hear breathing, ragged and shallow, as if someone, or something, was standing just inches away from me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing. The room was empty, silent once more. I didn't wait to find out what was next. I shoved the door again, desperation flooding my veins, and this time it gave way. I ran up the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground, and didn't stop until I was out of the basement, slamming the door behind me. Breathing heavily, I collapsed against the wall. The house felt different now, more oppressive, more alive. Something was in it, something that had been waiting for me. I could hear it even now, the faint whispering in the walls, the footsteps echoing in the distance. And I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't alone anymore. The following days were a blur. I tried to carry on with my normal routine, working from home, grocery shopping, cleaning the house, but everything felt off. There was a heaviness in the air, a constant unease that followed me from room to room. The house, which had seemed so comforting at first, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, set my nerves on edge. I knew something was wrong. It was more than just the house's age, more than the strange history that seemed to haunt every corner. There was a presence, an unexplainable feeling that followed me, watched me like something was lurking just out of sight. The whispering had returned, but it wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was everywhere. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of the house settling around me. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the whispering would start, distant at first, then growing louder, closer. I could never quite make out the words, but I knew they were meant for me. The voice was familiar now, as if it had always been there, waiting for me to listen. I began to see things too. Shadows that moved just out of the corner of my eye, figures that seemed to shift and disappear when I turned to face them. It was always the same, a flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't belong, and then nothing. But it was enough to make my skin crawl. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room trying to read a book to distract myself, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were unmistakable, slow, dragging, like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. I jumped up from the couch, heart racing, and hurried to the hallway. The sound was coming from the walls, like someone was walking just behind them. I pressed my ear against the wall, my breath shallow, my palms sweating. The footsteps were there, moving in a steady rhythm, coming closer. It felt like the walls themselves were alive, shifting, breathing, as if they were closing in on me. Suddenly the noise stopped. Complete silence. I pulled away from the wall, my pulse pounding in my ears. My mind raced. What was it? Was it just my imagination? Or was something real, something terrifying, lurking in the walls of this house? I took a step back, my body tense, ready to flee. But then I saw it. Crack. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. But as I stood there, staring at the wall, it began to widen. Slowly, a jagged line appeared, splitting the plaster down the middle. And then, from within the crack, I saw them. Hundreds of eyes, blinking and staring at me from the darkness inside the wall. The sight froze me in place, my breath catching in my throat. They were small, almost insect-like, but they were there, dozens of them blinking in unison, watching me. I stumbled back, my mind unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The crack in the wall widened further, the eyes following my every move, and I could hear the whispering again, louder now, clearer. The voices were no longer distant murmurs, but distinct words, calling my name, urging me to come closer, to see what was hidden in the wall. Panic surged through me and I ran. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just ran. I burst out the front door, breathing in the cold night air, as if that would somehow clear my mind, as if it would make the horror of what I had just witnessed go away. But it didn't. The whispering followed me outside. I stood on the porch, shivering, trying to gather my thoughts. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I could still hear it. The whispering, soft at first, then growing louder, like a chorus of voices all calling at once. It felt like they were in my head now, like they were a part of me, tugging at my mind, pulling me back inside. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts, but it was impossible. I felt trapped, stuck in the grip of something I didn't understand, something that had been waiting for me, watching me. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that house, not after what had happened. But I knew I couldn't stay away forever. I had to figure out what was going on, what was happening to me. I made up my mind to investigate the house's history further. I couldn't keep ignoring the strange events, the whispers, the eyes. I had to find out what was really going on, even if it meant confronting whatever dark force was living inside the walls. I went to the local library, hoping to find some old records or newspaper clippings that might shed light on the house's past. As I flipped through dusty old books and faded documents, I found a mention of the original owner, Margaret Whitmore. The records were sparse, but one thing stood out. Margaret Whitmore had been known for her obsession with the occult. She had been involved in strange rituals, conducting ceremonies in the house late at night, according to a few cryptic entries in a journal. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she had vanished. No one knew where she went or if she was ever seen again. But one thing was certain. Something had happened in that house. Something that had left a mark on it, something that had called to me, drawn me in. I sat there in the library, the weight of the discovery settling over me like a thick fog. I wasn't just dealing with a haunted house. I was dealing with something far darker, something that had been waiting for the right person to come along. And now it had chosen me. The whispering was louder now, even here in the library. I could hear it in my ears, calling me, urging me to return. The walls of the house were closing in on me, even from a distance, and I knew that I couldn't escape. I had to face whatever was waiting for me or it would consume me entirely. With a sense of dread, I left the library. There was no turning back now. The house was calling to me and I had no choice but to answer. By the time I returned to the house, the atmosphere had shifted. It felt thicker, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting me as I crossed the threshold. The house had always felt alive, but now it felt different, as if it were aware of my presence. Watching, waiting. I didn't want to go back to the wall where I had seen the eyes, but I knew I had to. I couldn't ignore what had happened any longer. The whispering had been relentless, even during my trip to the library. It had followed me home, burrowing into my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. I made my way to the hallway, my steps slow, deliberate. The house felt colder now, the chill sinking deep into my bones. As I passed the wall, I could feel it, the presence behind it pressing against the plaster, pushing its way through. The crack had widened just a little since I'd last seen it. The edges were jagged, like something had tried to tear its way out. I stopped in front of the wall, heart pounding, my breath shallow. The whispering was louder now, almost deafening, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. But amid the chaos of the noise, I thought I heard something else. A name, familiar yet foreign. Margaret. The name echoed in my mind, like a forgotten memory clawing its way to the surface. I had seen it in the library, but hearing it now sent a chill down my spine. Margaret Whitmore. The woman who had lived here before me, the one whose obsession with the occult had drawn me into this nightmare. I reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the crack in the wall. The moment my skin made contact with the cold plaster, a wave of energy surged through me, a jolt that nearly made me pull my hand away. But I couldn't. I was rooted in place, drawn to the wall as if it were alive, as if it were calling to me. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The voices were clearer now, chanting in unison, the words foreign, ancient. They seemed to be coming from inside the wall, from the very bones of the house. The words felt like they were meant for me, meant to draw me into the darkness, to open the door that Margaret had left behind. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no sense to be made. The house had its grip on me now, and I could feel it tightening, pulling me deeper into its web. Without thinking, I pressed my hand harder against the wall, desperate to stop the noise, desperate to understand. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. Silence. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. The crack in the wall had widened again, and I could see something moving in the darkness behind it. At first, it was just a shadow, something shifting, but then it took shape, becoming more distinct. A figure. A woman. She was standing in the darkness behind the wall, her face pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her hair was long, wild, and tangled, and her clothes were old, tattered, like they had been rotting away for years. The air around her seemed to shimmer, as if she were made of smoke, shifting and flickering with the dim light from the hallway. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place, unable to look away from the figure that stood in the wall. She was looking at me, her eyes vacant, her expression blank. But there was something else, something in her gaze that made my blood run cold. She wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, were others. More figures, their outlines barely discernible, like ghosts waiting in the dark. I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel them, feel their presence pressing in on me, closing in from all sides. The whispering started again, but it was different this time. It wasn't just voices, it was a language, ancient and primal, vibrating through the walls, through the very ground beneath my feet. It felt like the house itself was speaking to me, calling me into its depths. And then, as if the house had decided I had seen enough, the figure in the wall moved. She stepped forward, her body twisting unnaturally, her limbs jerking in a way that made my stomach churn. Her face twisted into a grotesque grin, her mouth stretching impossibly wide, her teeth sharp and yellowed. I stumbled back, heart racing, my feet tripping over the old rug as I fell to the floor. But the figure didn't stop. She kept coming, her body stretching and distorting, her hands reaching for me with claws that glinted in the dim light. I scrambled to my feet, panic surging through me. The house was alive and it was coming for me. I had to get out. I had to leave before it pulled me into its darkness. I ran, not looking back, not daring to see what was chasing me. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the yard, gasping for breath, my chest burning with the effort. But even outside, I couldn't escape the feeling. The house was watching me. The whispering followed me, drifting on the wind like a promise. It wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until it had me. I had to know more. I had to understand what had happened to Margaret Whitmore, what had drawn her to this house, to the occult, to whatever dark force she had unleashed. I had to know what had trapped her here, what had bound her to the walls. I couldn't leave. Not yet. And so, I went back inside, the door creaking shut behind me, the darkness closing in once again. But this time I was ready. I would face whatever was waiting for me. I would uncover the truth no matter what it took. The ritual was just beginning. The air inside the house was heavier than before, pressing down on me with each breath I took. The silence seemed to have deepened, almost suffocating, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just by the house, but by something, or someone, inside it. I had already seen too much to ignore it any longer. There was no going back now. I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret Whitmore. She had been the key, the one who had opened this door, and now I had to know more about her. What had driven her to madness? What had she uncovered that had led her to perform those rituals, that dark magic? Why was she still here, trapped in the walls of this house? The search for answers led me to the attic. It wasn't a place I had ventured into before. I had heard the stories, whispers of strange things found there, objects that should never have been touched. But tonight, the pull was undeniable. I had to go up there, no matter how much my gut twisted with dread. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The door to the attic was small, tucked away at the end of the hallway. I hesitated before I opened it. The cold air rushed out when I pushed the door, sending a shiver down my spine. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped inside, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The attic was cramped, filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs that seemed to have been left undisturbed for years. The smell was musty like old books and forgotten memories. It was the kind of place that didn't want to be disturbed, the kind of place that made you feel like you weren't alone, no matter how still it seemed. I moved through the clutter, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet as I searched for anything that might give me a clue about Margaret's life, her obsession with the occult. After what felt like hours, I found something, a small leather-bound journal, hidden in a box near the far corner of the room. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the cover was cracked, as if it had been tossed aside in haste. My heart skipped a beat as I carefully opened it, the pages making a soft rustling sound. The first entry was dated several years before Margaret had moved into this house. Her handwriting was neat, almost precise, but there was a strange edge to it, a sense of urgency in the way the words were written. She spoke of an interest in the occult, in rituals and spells, things that seemed harmless at first, just books and theories. But then as I read further, the tone shifted. The entries grew darker, more frantic, as if she had started to slip into something deeper, something dangerous. I read aloud to myself, my voice trembling as I spoke the words she had written. I feel it now. The pull, the call. It's stronger than ever. The house, it wants me. It wants something from me. I can feel its hunger, its presence lurking in the shadows. I know what I must do. The rituals are almost complete. The door is close. I can hear the whispers at night calling my name. I will open it. I will bring it through. I froze. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. She had opened something. Something had crossed into this world, and it was still here, waiting for its moment. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold spots, they weren't just echoes of the past. They were a warning, a sign that whatever Margaret had unleashed was still active, still hunting. I flipped through more pages, desperate for answers, until I found a drawing. It was crude, the lines shaky, but it was unmistakable. A door, an ancient wooden portal with symbols around it, symbols I recognized from some of the old occult books I had seen in the library. I had never thought I would come across something like this in real life, but now, seeing it on the page, my blood ran cold. The door. Margaret had opened a door to something dark, something powerful, and it had never closed. I could feel it now, that same presence pressing in around me, waiting to strike. I looked up from the journal, my flashlight flickering as I scanned the attic. Everything felt wrong. The shadows were deeper, more alive, and I could hear the creaking of floorboards from below, just like before. Only now it wasn't just a sound. There was movement. There was something, someone, coming for me. The journal fell from my hands as I heard it. A soft tapping, like fingernails on wood, coming from the far corner of the attic. I turned, flashlight shaking in my hands, but there was nothing there. The tapping stopped. Silence. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, frozen in place, as if the house itself had a hold on me. The tapping began again, louder this time, accompanied by a soft dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I turned around quickly, my flashlight flashing across the attic. But there was nothing except the old furniture and the piles of forgotten things. But I felt it. I felt the presence behind me, just beyond the beam of light. A cold breeze swept past me, and I turned just in time to see a shadow move, darting between the beams and the ceiling. My heart leapt in my chest as I scrambled back, my legs finally finding the strength to move. I had to get out. I had to leave before it caught me, before it dragged me into the darkness like it had done to Margaret. But as I turned toward the stairs, I heard a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. Leave, before it's too late. It was Margaret. Her voice was distorted, warped by time, but it was her. She had tried to warn me, but I hadn't listened. And now I was trapped in her nightmare. I ran down the stairs, not stopping until I reached the front door. But as I opened it, something stopped me. A figure standing in the doorway, blocking my escape. The woman from the wall. Margaret. Her eyes were wide, hollow, empty. Her mouth twisted into a grin, and she stepped forward, her body jerking unnaturally as if it were no longer human. And then she reached out for me. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart racing. But even then, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever had taken Margaret, whatever had been unleashed in that house, was still out there, waiting for the next person to come along. And I had a feeling that person was going to be me. I had to get out of town. I had to leave before it followed me, before it found me. But as I looked back at the house, I knew it was too late. The door had already opened. I couldn't stop running. My feet pounded against the pavement as I sprinted away from the house, away from the memories of what I had just seen, what I had just experienced. My mind was reeling, barely able to process the horrors that had unfolded in that attic. Margaret's face, twisted and unnatural, still haunted my thoughts, her warning echoing in my ears. Leave before it's too late. But was it already too late? I didn't want to think about it. I couldn't. Not right now. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. But as I ran, something felt off. The air, once cool and refreshing, now felt stifling, pressing in on me from all sides. My breath came in shallow gasps, each inhale harder than the last. The world around me seemed to fade in and out of focus, the streetlights flickering as though they were struggling to stay lit. It was as if the entire town had gone quiet, the usual hum of life drowned out by something darker, something that felt wrong. I stumbled, the ground beneath my feet shifting like sand, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of my vision. I whirled around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Only the empty street stretching out into the darkness. But then I heard it, a faint scraping sound like nails dragging across the concrete. My stomach churned and I froze, the sound growing louder, closer. My body wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The air seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping by the second. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the empty street. The shadows cast by the streetlights looked longer, more sinister now, as though they were reaching toward me, pulling me back toward the house. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the street. At first, it looked like nothing more than a dark silhouette, a shadow against the backdrop of the dimly lit road. But as I stared, my heart skipped a beat. It was her. Margaret. Or at least it looked like her. Her pale face was distorted in the same twisted grin I had seen in the attic, her eyes hollow, lifeless. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get away from her, but my body refused to obey. The figure didn't move, only stood there, watching me with an eerie stillness. Then, as if sensing my fear, it stepped forward. Slowly. Relentlessly. I couldn't tear my eyes away as it drew closer, its form becoming clearer with each step. The streetlights flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw it. The shape of something else moving behind her, something large, dark, and formless, shifting in the shadows. My stomach lurched. It wasn't just Margaret. Whatever had taken her, whatever had driven her to madness, was with her. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure moved closer, and I could hear her now, her voice faint but unmistakable. Leave, before it's too late. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as she stepped closer, the shadows around her twisting and writhing like living things, drawn to her, feeding off her presence. And then she stopped, just a few feet away from me. Her eyes, empty and dark, locked onto mine. Her mouth parted in that grotesque grin, but no words came out. The air around me was thick, suffocating. I could hear the scraping again, louder now, coming from all around me. And then I felt it. A cold hand, an icy grip on my shoulder. It wasn't Margaret's hand. It couldn't have been. It was something else, something that felt wrong, unnatural. My breath hitched in my throat as I twisted around, but there was no one there. The shadows were closing in. I spun around, desperate to break free from whatever grip held me, and stumbled backward, away from the figure. The street was empty now. The lights flickered one last time before going out completely, leaving me in total darkness. But the presence was still there. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to escape. But with every step I took, the feeling of being followed grew stronger, more oppressive. The scraping sound was back, this time accompanied by whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. I couldn't make them out, but I could feel them in my bones. They were speaking to me, calling me, dragging me back toward the house. The shadows were everywhere now. They pressed in from all sides, creeping up the walls of buildings, slithering along the ground, following my every move. The air was colder, the night darker, and the weight of the presence behind me was unbearable. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of town, away from everything. But as I turned the corner, I saw it. The house. The house I had just fled. It loomed in the distance, standing tall and menacing, its windows dark and empty. I should have kept running, but my feet refused to move. It was as if the house was calling to me, pulling me back. And then, in the window, I saw her again. Margaret. Her face pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes staring out at me. She was still grinning, her body contorted in that unnatural way, her form flickering in and out of view like a shadow caught in the wind. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I tried to move, the house was always there. Watching. Waiting. And then, from the shadows, a new figure emerged. A tall man, his face obscured by darkness. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. His eyes, when they caught the dim light, were cold, dead. He reached out a hand, and the shadows seemed to respond, stretching toward him like tendrils of smoke. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The darkness was closing in, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it swallowed me whole. Before I could scream, the figure stepped forward, and everything went black. And then, silence. I woke up, or I thought I did, but nothing felt real anymore. The streets were empty. The air was still. The house was gone. But I could hear the whispers just beneath the surface calling me back. And I knew then I was never going to escape. The house had claimed me just as it had claimed Margaret. It was too late. The door had opened. I don't know how long I was gone. It felt like days, maybe weeks, or maybe just a few minutes. The air around me was heavy, thick with a weight I couldn't shake, like I was trapped in a fog I couldn't see or touch. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The oppressive, unnerving kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The kind where every breath you take feels too loud. My head was spinning and my body felt like it was dragging behind me, but I pushed forward, unsure of where I was going or how I got there. Everything felt wrong. The world around me was unfamiliar, but also eerily familiar. I stumbled through streets I didn't recognize, passing buildings that seemed both strange and, well, too familiar. I glanced up at the sky, but there was no sun, no moon, just a dim gray haze that stretched endlessly across the horizon. The streets were empty, no sounds of life anywhere. No cars, no people, no animals. Just the deafening quiet. My heart raced in my chest as I continued walking, unsure of what was real and what wasn't. I tried to shake the fog in my head, but it clung to me like a second skin. And then, just ahead, I saw it. The house. It wasn't supposed to be here. I had left it. I had run. I had escaped. But there it was, standing tall and imposing, its windows dark, the once welcoming porch now a hollow, twisted mockery of what it had been. My body froze. My mind screamed for me to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't move. They felt like they were made of stone, locked in place as though the house had reached out and grabbed hold of me. I couldn't look away. As I approached, the air grew colder and the whispers returned, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. I didn't need to hear the words. I felt them. They crawled under my skin, wrapping around my bones. I could feel the presence there just beyond my reach, watching, waiting. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to know what was waiting for me, but something was pulling me in, something stronger than my fear. It was like the house was calling to me. I didn't have a choice. I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air seemed to change. It was colder inside than I remembered, even colder than outside, as if the house itself was breathing in the dark. The floor creaked beneath my feet, the familiar sound both comforting and terrifying at once. The smell was the same, musty and damp, mixed with something else, something faintly rotten like decaying wood and forgotten secrets. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but my feet kept moving, taking me deeper into the house. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the floor itself was dragging me down into the earth. The walls seemed to close in on me, narrowing with every step I took. I made my way through the dimly lit hall, the flickering lights overhead casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. I reached the living room and froze. There, sitting in the middle of the room, was the old chair, the one that I had seen in the attic. The same chair where Margaret had sat, her pale face twisted in that horrid grin. The chair was empty now, but I could feel it, something had been there. The weight of it, lingering in the air, was enough to make my skin crawl. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, but the door had closed behind me and the house had swallowed me whole. The walls felt alive, pulsing with some dark energy that seemed to seep into the air, thick and suffocating. I could almost hear it, soft murmurs, whispers in the corners of the room, as if the house itself was alive and speaking in some forgotten language. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, like someone was pacing the hall above me. I wasn't alone. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as though someone, or something, was coming down the stairs. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, constricted by a terror I couldn't explain. The footsteps stopped. I stood there in the silence, waiting, but nothing happened. The house was still. The whispers had stopped. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my chest, so loud it drowned out everything else. My hand reached out, brushing against the wall as I tried to steady myself. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, just a whisper, but it grew louder, more distinct. Leave? I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat. Margaret stood at the doorway, her face pale, eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. She was shaking, her hands trembling at her sides. She looked the same as she had when I first saw her, but there was something different now, something darker in her eyes, something that wasn't there before. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Leave? She mouthed again. I took a step toward her, my heart racing, but before I could reach her, the room went black. The floor beneath me seemed to disappear, and I felt myself falling, weightless, as though I was being pulled into some abyss, deeper and deeper into the house. I screamed, but no sound escaped my mouth. The darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment I thought I was dead. And then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness, only the silence, and the whispers, always the whispers. I couldn't escape. The darkness around me was thick, suffocating. It clung to my skin, filled my lungs with its heavy weight. I couldn't breathe. The silence was so absolute that my heartbeat felt like a drumbeat in my ears. Every second dragged on, stretching the terror to unbearable lengths. I couldn't see anything, couldn't move, couldn't even scream. My legs felt frozen, my arms limp by my sides. I was no longer standing in the living room, no longer on solid ground. I was falling or floating, both at once. A sensation of weightlessness gripped me, but it wasn't comforting. It was cold, cold to the core. And then, as if some unseen force had decided I had lingered in the dark for long enough, the world around me shifted. I felt my feet touch the ground once more, but it wasn't the creaky floorboards of the house. No, this was something else. The surface beneath me was soft, damp, and squishy. The air smelled musty, with the faintest trace of something sour, like rotting wood or wet earth. I was in the basement. I had been there once before, but it had felt so long ago, like a lifetime. The memory of it was hazy, like trying to recall a dream after waking. I didn't want to be here again. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. But I could hear something moving in the dark, a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps but lighter, almost hesitant. It was then that I felt it. A cold, clammy pressure on my wrist. Someone, or something, was holding me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The pressure tightened, as though whatever it was trying to pull me closer. A low, guttural sound vibrated in my ear, but I couldn't make out the words. It was almost like a whisper, like someone was speaking too softly to be heard, but the sound itself felt like it was scraping against my very soul. I tried to yank my arm away, but it was no use. The grip was unyielding like iron. A jolt of panic surged through me as I turned my head, my eyes desperately trying to adjust to the pitch-black surroundings. And then I saw it. A figure. It was barely there, just a shadow in the periphery of my vision, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The figure was tall, too tall, its outline indistinct, shifting like smoke. It took a step toward me. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my heart hammering in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My mind screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. The figure loomed closer, its presence like a wall of ice. Every step it took was deliberate, slow. It wasn't in any hurry. It was toying with me, savoring my fear. And then it stopped. Right in front of me. I couldn't see its face. There was no face, just darkness. It was like staring into the void itself, a black hole where nothing could exist. But I could feel it, its eyes, invisible yet burning, locked onto mine. The pressure on my wrist grew, tightening until it felt like my bones might snap. My entire body shook, and I could feel my knees giving way beneath me. I dropped to the floor, gasping for air as the cold pressed in, swallowing me whole. And then the voice. It was the same voice from before, the one I had heard in the house, the one I had heard in my nightmares. But this time it was clearer. louder. "Leave," it whispered. "Leave, before it's too late." I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, choking on the words I couldn't say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but the fear was too overwhelming. There was no reason. There was no logic here. Just this thing, this presence that was too powerful to fight. The figure crouched down, its invisible eyes boring into me. The voice was clearer now, close enough that I could feel its breath, cold and rancid. "She won't let you go," it said. "She never lets anyone go." I didn't know what it meant. Who was she? What was it talking about? But before I could process it, I felt something move behind me. A cold gust of air. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness. But the whispering started again, louder this time, rising in volume and intensity. "Leave?" Suddenly I was yanked backward. A sharp pain shot through my arm as though someone had grabbed it with vicious force. The invisible grip tightened, pulling me toward the figure. I couldn't fight back. I couldn't move. It was too strong, too relentless. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The grip vanished. The darkness faded. I was lying on the floor of the living room again. Everything was still. Everything was silent. But the weight of what had happened lingered, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't trust my own mind anymore. I couldn't trust my senses. The house, it wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding on fear, feeding on the souls of those foolish enough to stay. I pulled myself up, my body trembling, my head spinning. I didn't know what was real anymore, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But as I turned to go, I heard it again. A soft creak from the stairs above. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving closer. And I knew deep down that it wasn't over. It would never be over. I didn't sleep that night. The sounds continued, the footsteps, the creaking, the whispering that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I felt like I was being hunted, but there was nowhere to run. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the more I tried to push the fear down, the stronger it became. It wasn't just a haunting. It was an imprisonment. But I knew I couldn't stay in the house, not after what happened. I had to find a way out, but first I needed answers. I couldn't just leave without knowing the truth about what had been happening here, about what had happened to the people who had come before me. The next morning, the sun barely touched the sky, casting a dim light through the dirty windows. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking as I searched through the house, looking for anything that might explain the horrors I had witnessed. The attic, the basement, even the closets, everything was a dead end. There was nothing of importance, nothing that gave me a sense of closure. But then, as I entered the kitchen, something caught my eye. A faint indentation on the floor beneath the rug, almost like something had been moved recently. I lifted the rug slowly, heart hammering in my chest, and there it was, a trapdoor. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle, lifting it with a creak that echoed through the empty house. Beneath it was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I didn't want to go down there. Part of me screamed to leave, to forget about the house and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I grabbed the flashlight, taking a deep breath before descending into the basement. The air was thick with mildew, and the walls were lined with old, forgotten relics, boxes of junk, old furniture, and something else. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. On the far wall, hidden behind a stack of crates, was a wooden shelf. And on that shelf, tucked away in the corner, was a small leather-bound book. I didn't have to open it to know what it was. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, that cold, gnawing sense that whatever was in that book was the key to everything that had been happening to me. I pulled it down and flipped it open. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. It wasn't a diary, but something much worse. A journal of rituals, curses, and names I didn't recognize. Each page seemed more disturbing than the last, detailing strange occurrences, unexplainable phenomena, and a series of steps meant to unlock something. Something that should have remained hidden. I skimmed through the pages, my eyes scanning the words, each one chilling my blood more than the last. There were names of people who had lived in the house before me. People who had all disappeared under mysterious circumstances. One name stood out, Eliza Moore. The name was written in bold letters, like it had been written with more force, more urgency. I turned the page, desperate to understand more. And there it was. Eliza had been the original owner of the house, and she had been obsessed with the occult. The journal detailed her descent into madness, her obsession with a ritual meant to open a doorway to another realm. She had believed that she could summon something powerful, something ancient, by performing a series of dark rituals in the house. But something had gone wrong. She had become obsessed with the idea that the house itself was a conduit, a portal to the other side. The last entry was almost unreadable, but I could make out a few key words. Too late, can't close it, and she won't let me. The chill in my bones grew stronger as I read those words, and the world around me seemed to warp and distort, like the house itself was listening to me, waiting for me to finish. And then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound from above. My heart skipped a beat. My breath caught in my throat. It was the sound of footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving through the house. I quickly shoved the journal into my jacket and ran back up the stairs, my pulse racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as though the thing that haunted this place had finally decided to confront me. I reached the top of the stairs and froze. There, standing in the hallway, was a figure. It wasn't human. It was something else. A shape that was there and not there at the same time, flickering in and out of existence. I could see it, but only in flashes. Its tall, thin body, its limbs long and unnatural, twisted in ways they shouldn't have been. I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone, frozen in place. It whispered to me, but the words were lost in the wind. It was like it was speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend, a language that was older than time itself. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. I didn't wait. I didn't need to see more. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house, standing on the front lawn, gasping for air. My heart was racing, my body drenched in sweat, but I couldn't move. I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to go back. I had to confront it. But first I needed to know. What had Eliza unleashed? What had she opened? I wasn't sure if I was brave or just foolish, but there was no turning back now. I would find out the truth, even if it meant facing whatever had been waiting in the dark for all these years. I stood there in the front yard, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I looked back at the house. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper that I couldn't quite make out. It was as if the house was calling to me, pleading with me to come back, to finish what I had started. But I couldn't. Not yet. I glanced down at the journal in my hand, still gripped tightly like a lifeline. Eliza's words echoed in my mind, the fear and desperation clear in her scrawled handwriting. She had tried to warn me, hadn't she? Tried to tell me that it was too late, that whatever was in the house couldn't be stopped. I couldn't help but wonder if I was already too far gone. I turned and walked away from the house, but every step felt heavier, like something invisible was pulling me back. It was as though the house was never going to let me go. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to tell myself that I was safe, that whatever haunted that house couldn't follow me into the world beyond its walls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was always just behind me, lurking in the shadows. At night, I would hear it. The footsteps, the whispers, the same sounds that had tormented me in the house. But now they followed me everywhere. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it was there. It wasn't the house that had haunted me. It was the thing that Eliza had unleashed. The thing that had waited for her to finish the ritual, and now that it was free, it was searching for someone else. And it had found me. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination. But the more I pushed it away, the closer it seemed to get. The cold spots, the shuffling footsteps, the shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. They became more frequent, more intense. I couldn't escape it. I knew what I had to do. The journal told me there was a way to close the door Eliza had opened, a way to stop the thing from coming after me, and everyone else. But the ritual, just like the one Eliza had performed, came at a price. I had to return to the house. The thought of going back there made my stomach twist in knots, but I knew I had no choice. If I didn't, the thing would never stop. It would never leave me alone. I gathered the courage to step into the house one final time, my heart pounding in my chest as I opened the front door. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could feel it, the presence watching me from the shadows. I wasn't alone. The house had changed since the last time I was there. The walls seemed darker, the air heavier. It felt more alive, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I made my way to the basement, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, and the cold air grew more oppressive with every step. The journal had said that I needed to perform the ritual in the same place where Eliza had opened the door. In the basement, where the walls had been marked with strange symbols and where the darkness had seeped into the very foundation of the house. I set the journal down on the floor, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. The ritual was simple enough. Speak the words, draw the symbols, and wait for the thing to reveal itself. But as I read the words aloud, I felt something shift in the air. The house seemed to grow darker, the shadows longer, and I knew deep down that I was no longer alone. The temperature dropped, and I could hear the soft, shuffling footsteps again, getting closer, faster. I looked up, and there it was, standing at the edge of the basement, flickering in and out of existence. It wasn't human. I took a step back, my mind racing. I couldn't stop. I had to finish the ritual no matter what. But as I finished speaking the last words, the figure lunged. A flash of coldness, the stench of decay, and I felt it, something cold, something sharp, pressing against my chest. I gasped for air, struggling to breathe as the darkness closed in on me. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I opened my eyes, gasping for breath. The house was silent. The thing was gone. I stumbled to my feet, my body shaking, my chest heaving as I looked around the basement. The air had cleared. The cold was gone. I had done it. I had closed the door. But as I made my way back upstairs, I heard it again. The footsteps, the whispers, faint and distant, but unmistakable. I had sealed it away for now, but the house would always be there. And so would the thing that Eliza had let out. It wasn't over. The house was still waiting, still watching. And one day it would find someone else.